The rain had been falling for 3 days without stopping, and the ditch along the Renfield Road had filled with cold, dark water that smelled of mud and dead leaves. It was the kind of rain that did not pour. It pressed, steadily, without mercy, soaking through wool and cotton and skin, until a person forgot what it felt like to be dry. Clara Voss had been walking for 6 hours in it. Her boots had stopped keeping water out somewhere around the 2nd mile, and by the time she reached the long bend in the road where the oak trees leaned over from both sides and made a kind of tunnel, she had given up any hope of arriving at her new post looking presentable. She told herself it did not matter. She told herself the letter of introduction in her coat pocket, wrapped in oilskin, was what mattered. She told herself a great many things during that walk, because silence inside her own head was not something she could afford on a day like this. She was 23 years old and had spent the last 2 weeks calculating. 12 shillings and 4pence was what she had left, after paying for her room in the boarding house at Ely, after the train fare to Derbyshire, after the modest expense of having her only good blouse laundered before the journey. 12 shillings and 4pence stood between her and a situation she did not allow herself to name, because naming it made it too real. She had a destination, a house called Ferngate, belonging to a family named Holford, who required a governess for 2 daughters, aged 7 and 9. The letter confirming the position was also in her pocket, though it was a month old by now, and she had written twice since to confirm her arrival date, and received no reply. She had decided to arrive anyway. She did not have the luxury of waiting for certainty. The sound reached her before she saw anything. It was small and thin, almost swallowed by the rain, a kind of uneven breathing, the sort a person makes when they have been crying for so long that the crying has exhausted itself and left behind only the mechanical rise and fall of a chest that does not yet know it can stop. Clara slowed her pace. She was not a woman who startled easily. Her childhood had taken that out of her. But the sound was strange enough in the middle of an empty road that she stopped walking entirely and stood still, listening. The rain pressed down. The oak trees dripped. And then she heard it again, lower, coming from the left side of the road, where the ditch deepened and a tangle of roots and dead bracken made a kind of shelf above the water. She stepped off the road carefully, her boots sinking immediately into mud, and pushed aside a branch that had fallen across the ditch. What she found stopped her breathing for a full moment. A child lay wedged between the root shelf and the bank of the ditch, half in the water, half out of it, his face turned sideways against the mud. He was wearing clothes that were clearly good clothes, a wool jacket with proper buttons, dark trousers, leather boots that were now entirely submerged. But the clothes were so soaked and so covered in mud that it took her a moment to register their quality. The child was not unconscious, but he was close to it. His eyes were open and staring at nothing, and his lips were moving without any sound coming out, and his body was shaking in a way that had nothing to do with trying to stay warm, and everything to do with having already lost the battle. Clara did not spend time deciding what to do. She had been poor long enough to understand that in moments of real danger, the person who spends time weighing options is the person who arrives too late. She got into the ditch, both feet, knees bent, cold water rushing into her already soaked boots, and she got her arms under the child and lifted. He was heavier than she expected. He was also burning. Through all the cold water and all the wet wool, she could feel the heat coming off his skin, like something was lit inside him, and she understood immediately that the fever had been there before the ditch, that it had perhaps been the reason he was in the ditch at all. She got him up onto the road and sat him against her, his back against her chest, his head rolling against her collarbone, and she spoke to him. She did not say anything clever or reassuring or particularly wise. She said his name was not known to her, so she called him dear and sweetheart, in the way her own mother had called her when she was small, before things went wrong at home. And she told him he was out of the water now, and that she had him, and that she was not going to let go. She said this last thing 3 times, because she found she needed to hear it herself. The village of Renfield was 2 miles back the way she had come. She had passed through it that morning, walking fast, not stopping, because stopping cost time and she had none to spare. She knew there was an inn there. She had noticed it, the way a person who is always calculating notices anything that represents warmth or shelter, and she had walked past it. Now she turned around and walked back toward it, carrying the child when she could, and half dragging him when she could not, stopping twice to rest on a mile marker stone, feeling the fever heat radiating off him, even through the rain, counting her steps, because counting was something to do that was not panicking. The innkeeper's wife was a broad woman named Edith Crane, who had been keeping a fire going in the front room all morning because the cold had come early this year, and her own joints had told her so. She opened the door when Clara knocked and looked at the pair of them. The young woman with mud up to her knees, and a sick child half propped against her shoulder, and she did not ask any questions. She simply stood aside and let them in, and called out for her husband, and told Clara to sit by the fire, and went directly to the kitchen to heat water. Clara sat. The child sat beside her, listing sideways, and she kept her arm around him. His shaking had eased slightly in the warmth, but his breathing was wrong. Too fast, with a rattle at the bottom of it that made her stomach tighten. It was while they were waiting for Edith's husband to go for the doctor that the boy spoke for the first time. His voice was almost nothing, barely a thread of sound. He said, "She is not at the churchyard." Clara looked at him. His eyes were not quite focused, and she understood he was not fully present yet. The fever was still talking. She said carefully, "Who is not?" He said, "My mother." And then he closed his eyes again, and his head fell back against her arm, and she held him and said nothing, because there was nothing to say to that. She had been 8 years old when her own mother died, and she knew from direct experience that there was nothing to say. What helped, the only thing that had ever helped, was not being alone in the dark. So she kept her arm where it was, and she did not move, and she let him sleep against her in the warmth. The doctor arrived within the hour. He was a man named Dr. Owen Price, 60 years old, with the careful hands and tired eyes of someone who had been called out in bad weather too many times to be impressed by it. He examined the boy thoroughly, took his temperature, listened to his chest, and pressed his lips together in the way that doctors do when they have an opinion they are organizing into careful language. He told Clara the child had a serious fever, likely brought on by exposure, and that the beginning of something in his chest needed watching. He said the child should not be moved for at least 2 days, should be kept warm and given fluids, and should have someone with him through the night. Clara looked at Dr. Price, and then looked at Edith Crane, and then looked at the 8 shillings and 4 pence she had remaining, and she did the arithmetic in her head while keeping her face perfectly still. The room would cost something. The doctor's fee would cost something. Food and whatever medicinal preparation was needed would cost something. By the time she had finished the arithmetic, she knew that arriving at the Halford house in the condition she needed to arrive in, with enough money to present herself as a capable, independent woman who was not in desperate need, was no longer possible. She had a choice between the child and the impression. She was not sure it was really a choice at all. She paid the doctor from her money. She arranged for the room. She told Edith Crane that she needed broth, good broth, the kind with bone in it, and was told that it would be ready within the hour, and she paid for that too. She watched the coins leave her hand, with the same expression a person wears when they are doing something irrevocable, and have decided not to waste energy regretting it. Edith brought blankets. Clara removed the child's wet things. He had drifted back into sleep, and wrapped him in the blankets, and sat in the chair beside the narrow bed, and began the job of watching through the night. She did not know his name. She did not know where he had come from, or how long he had been in that ditch, or why he had been on a road in the middle of Derbyshire, alone in the rain. She knew he was a boy, perhaps 8 or 9 years old, with dark hair and good boots, and the kind of bone structure that came from several generations of eating well. She knew his mother was dead. She knew he had the fever and the beginning of something in his chest, and that tonight was important. She focused on those things and set aside everything else. Around midnight, his temperature rose. She had been given a cloth and a basin of cool water by Edith, and she used them, laying the cloth across his forehead and replacing it every few minutes when it warmed, speaking to him in a low voice, even though he could not hear her. She told him things she had never told anyone. She told him about her father's schoolroom, which had smelled of chalk and old books, and had been the best place she knew before it closed. She told him about a dog she had once had for 3 weeks, until the landlord of their lodgings discovered it and made her give it away. She told him that his mother, whoever she was not in the ground where they had put her, because the people who love us do not stay in the ground. They go somewhere the darkness does not reach, somewhere like a very clear night sky. She told him this, not because she was certain it was true, but because she was certain it was kind, and kindness was the only medicine she could offer that cost nothing. Near 3 in the morning, his fever broke. It did not drop gently. It released all at once, the way a fist opens, and he exhaled, and went still, in a way that was different from the earlier stillness, quieter, more settled, and Clara sat very straight in her chair, with her heart going hard in her chest, until she put her hand on his, and felt the heat coming off him in a normal way again, steady and human, not raging. She let out a breath she felt like she had been holding since she found him in the ditch. She must have slept at some point, because she woke to gray morning light and the smell of coal smoke from somewhere below, and the sound of rain still going at the window, and the boy looking directly at her. He was awake, and his eyes were clear now, not fever-glassy, and he was looking at her with the focused, assessing gaze of a child who is taking in a stranger and making up his mind about them. Clara looked back at him. She said, "Good morning." He said, "Are you a servant?" She said, "I am a governess, or I will be shortly." He appeared to consider this. He said, "My name is Edmund." She said, "My name is Miss Voss." He said, "You stayed all night?" She said, "Yes." He said, "Why?" She looked at him for a moment. Then she said, "Because someone needed to." He was quiet after that for a while, looking at the ceiling. Then he said, very quietly, "I was trying to find her." Clara did not ask who. She already knew. She said, "I know." He said, "I thought if I went far enough." His voice broke on the last word, just for a moment, and then he pressed his lips together and was still again, and she could see him working hard at something, not crying, or not letting her see him cry, which in an 8-year-old boy who had clearly been taught that composure was important, was both heartbreaking and understandable. She did not offer comfort in words, because she had learned long ago that words in those moments were mostly for the person offering them. She reached out instead and put her hand over his, a small, plain gesture that said nothing and meant everything, and she left it there, while the rain pressed on outside, and the fire in the room downstairs built itself up for the morning. It was Edith Crane who came upstairs with the broth and found them like that. The thin young governess and the sick child, hand to hand, neither of them speaking, and it was Edith who sent her own boy out on the horse to the nearest town to ask if anyone was looking for a missing child, because something about the quality of those boots and that jacket had been speaking to her all night. She sent her boy at 6 in the morning. By 8, the answer had come back. By 9, 3 men on horseback were coming down the road toward the Renfield Inn, at a speed that suggested they had not slept either. Clara was standing at the upstairs window when they arrived. She watched the men dismount in the yard below, and she watched the tension in their bodies, the way they moved fast, checking every direction, and she understood that these were not ordinary men, and that the child in the narrow bed behind her was not an ordinary child. She turned and looked at Edmund, who had heard the horses and was sitting up, and there was something in his face, a complicated thing, part relief and part dread, that told her everything she needed to know about what waited for him downstairs. She said, "Your people have come." He looked at her. He said, "Will you come down with me?" She thought about her 8 shillings, now reduced to 4 pence. She thought about the Holford house, the letter with no reply, the post she had almost certainly lost by turning around in the rain. She thought about the arithmetic and what it meant now. Then she looked at the boy who had asked her not to leave, and she said yes. She picked up her coat, which was still damp, and she put it on, and she walked with him down the narrow stairs toward whatever was waiting at the bottom. She did not know, in that moment, that the decision to say yes was the one that would determine the shape of the next 40 years of her life. She knew only that a child had asked her not to leave, and she had said yes, and that for now, that was enough. The man who had been leading the 3 riders was named Gareth Cole. He was the Duke's head steward, a tall man in a dark coat, with a face that had the particular look of someone who had spent the last 3 days managing a crisis without sleeping, and was now required to maintain an expression of controlled professionalism over the top of complete exhaustion. He took one look at Edmund, standing at the bottom of the stairs, and his jaw moved slightly, just once, before he controlled it. He crossed the room in 4 strides and crouched in front of the boy, and he put one hand carefully on Edmund's shoulder, and he looked at him for a long moment without speaking. Then he straightened and turned to Clara. He said, "Are you the woman who found him?" She said she was. He said, "Was anyone else involved in his care through the night?" She said no. It had been herself and the innkeeper's wife. He looked at her for a moment with an expression she could not quite read, something between assessment and something that might, in another kind of man, have been called gratitude. and then he said that she would be compensated for any expenses incurred. Clara said nothing. She was watching Edmund, who was standing very still beside her, not moving toward the men who had come for him, and she understood that the stillness was deliberate. She reached down and took his hand. He gripped it immediately, hard, the way children grip things when they are holding themselves together, and Gareth Cole saw this and said nothing, and the room held a kind of silence that was full of things no one was saying. In the end, it was Edmund himself who moved. He walked toward Gareth Cole, keeping hold of Clara's hand, so that she had to walk with him, and he said in a voice that was still thin from the fever, but absolutely clear, "She is coming with us." Gareth Cole looked at the clasped hands, and then at Clara's face, and then at the floor, and he made the decision that people in his position always make, when a child of that household speaks with that particular quiet certainty. He said, "Yes, my lord," and that was how Clara Voss arrived at Ashford Hall for the first time, not through the front entrance, which she would never use as a matter of course, and not with her good blouse, and her letter of introduction, and her 12 shillings, which plan had dissolved entirely in the rain. She arrived cold and muddy, and 4pence to her name, in a carriage borrowed from the Renfield Inn, with a duke's son holding her hand, and a head steward diplomatically looking out of the window. Ashford Hall was not what Clara had expected, though she could not have said precisely what she had expected. She had grown up hearing the word duke used the way people used words for things that existed in another order of reality entirely: kings, judges, bishops, dukes, so that the actual building, when it came into view through the carriage window, landed on her with a strange doubling sensation, both more real and more impossible than the idea of it. It was enormous. That was the first and simplest fact. It sat on a rise above a park that went on long enough that the far tree line was a dark smudge, and the building itself was gray stone under the gray October sky, and it had more windows than she could count from the moving carriage. Edmund, sitting beside her with his hands in his lap, did not look at it. He was looking at his own hands. She said nothing to him during the drive. She had learned, in the hours of the night, something about the rhythm of his silences. Which ones were the kind that needed filling, and which ones were the kind that needed respect. This one was the second kind. He was preparing himself for something. She could see that. The set of his jaw, the deliberate steadiness of his breathing, these were not the habits of a child. They were the habits of someone who had been required to perform composure in front of people, and had practiced until the performance had become, at least from the outside, almost indistinguishable from the real thing. She found this both admirable and deeply sad, and she sat beside him in silence, and let him have the journey. The carriage stopped, not at the front of the house, but at a side entrance, the kind of entrance that said something immediately about where in the order of things the occupants of the carriage were expected to place themselves. Gareth Cole stepped down first, said something brief to one of the other men, and then opened the door with an expression that was professional and unreadable. Edmund got out without assistance, steadily, with the slightly too careful walk of someone who is still not entirely well, and is refusing to let it show. Clara followed. She stood in the gravel of the side yard and looked up at the stone wall of the house and breathed. She was taken, almost immediately, to a small room off the back of the main corridor. A room that had been someone's sitting room once, and was now used for storage, judging by the boxes stacked along one wall, and was told by a young housemaid named Nora that she should wait there. The housemaid said this with the particular combination of shyness and authority that servants develop when they are giving instructions to people whose social position is unclear. Clara sat in the only chair that was not covered in boxes, and folded her hands in her lap and waited, which was something she was good at. Waiting was a skill. A person in her position learned that early. She had been sitting for perhaps 20 minutes when she heard the voices in the corridor outside. One was Gareth Cole's, measured and careful. The other was different, lower, with an edge to it that was not quite anger and not quite grief, but was made of the same materials as both. She heard her own name spoken once. She heard the word circumstances, and the word appropriate, and then a silence, and then more words she could not distinguish. Then the door opened. The Duke of Carlisle was 51 years old. He was a tall man, which she had somehow expected, but the other things about him she had not. The pallor under the complexion, the slight hollowness around the eyes that came from too little sleep and too much worry, organized into too rigid a containment. He was dressed with complete correctness, as though the last 4 days of searching for his missing child had not disturbed a single element of his presentation, but his hands, which he held behind his back, were gripped together hard enough that the knuckles were white. Clara stood when he entered, because that was what you did, and she met his eyes because that was what she did, not in defiance, but because she had been poor long enough to understand that looking away invited a particular kind of treatment she could not afford. He looked at her for a moment. Then he said, "I am told you found my son." She said yes. He said, "I am told you kept him through the night." She said yes. He said, "What did you spend?" She said, with a precision that she had calculated in the carriage, 8 shillings and 4pence, your grace. He reached into his coat, drew out a leather case, and counted 8 shillings and 4 pennies onto the side table with the methodical care of a man settling a bill. He said, "You will be compensated for your time as well." She said, "That is not necessary." He looked at her again, this time with a slight shift of expression that might have been surprise. He said, "Most people in your position would not say that." She said, "I did not do it for compensation." He said nothing for a moment. Then he said, "What post were you traveling to?" She told him about the Holford house, the position, the fact that she had turned around in the rain. He pressed his lips together. He said, "I see." What happened next was not what she had imagined might happen. In the brief moments in the carriage, when she had allowed herself to imagine anything, she had thought he might offer a small further payment, or a letter of reference, or at most, a ride to the nearest town. She had not thought he would stand in that cluttered room and say, very directly, without any preamble, "My son has not had a governess since his mother died. He has refused them. I have not pressed the matter because there were other things to manage." He stopped there, and she understood that the other things included grief, though he did not use that word. He said, "He appears to have accepted you." She said, "I was simply present when he needed someone to be." The Duke said, "In my experience, that is rarely simple." He offered her the position before she had time to respond to that. He named a salary that was better than the Holford house had offered, which she registered and stored, and did not allow to appear on her face. He said the position would include a room, meals, and a clothing allowance, which told her something about what he expected a governess in his household to look like, that she filed away for later consideration. He said he would require her to begin within the week, as Edmund would be returning from the doctor's supervision by then, and would need a structured environment. He said all of this in the tone of a man who was accustomed to terms being accepted rather than negotiated. And he was correct. She accepted. She accepted because she needed the post. She also accepted because of the boy upstairs, though she would not have said so. She did not see Edmund again that first day. She was given the small room she would occupy for the next 4 years, on the upper floor, at the end of the children's wing, with a window that looked out over the kitchen garden, and, beyond it, the gray shimmer of a pond. The room had a narrow bed, a desk, a chair, and a wardrobe that smelled of cedar, and it was the first room she had occupied in 3 years that was entirely her own, without another woman's things in it, without a landlady's knock to expect. She sat on the edge of the bed, and looked at the window, and allowed herself, for exactly 1 minute, to feel the relief of it, and then she put the feeling away, and began to think about what came next. What came next, as it turned out, was Edmund. He appeared at her door the following morning at 6:55, before she had finished dressing, and knocked in the particular way children knock when they have decided to be polite, but are not sure patience is a virtue they currently possess. She opened the door. He was dressed, which surprised her. She had half expected him to still be ill, but he had clearly been determined otherwise, and he was carrying a book. He held the book out to her. He said, "I want to read this, but some of the words are difficult." She looked at the book. It was a natural history of birds, moderately advanced, clearly from the library downstairs. She said, "Good morning, Lord Edmund." He said, "Good morning, Miss Voss." She said, "Come in then." That was the beginning. It was not a dramatic beginning. It was a child at a door, with a book about birds, and a young woman who had spent 8 shillings she did not have, and gotten up at 6 in the morning to be ready for whatever the day required, and the two of them sitting at the desk by the window while the October light came through the glass, and they worked through the difficult words one by one. She noticed, in that first hour, certain things about him. He was genuinely curious, not the performed curiosity of children, who have been taught that asking questions impresses adults, but the real kind, which was visible in the way he leaned forward when something interested him, and forgot entirely to maintain the careful posture that someone had obviously been working on with him. He was quick. He made connections between things without being prompted. He read something about the migration of birds and immediately asked why the birds went south rather than north, and then, before she could answer, said maybe it was because south was where it was warmer, and then, after a further pause, said but then how did they know? And this last question was so good that she stopped and said so, and he looked up at her with an expression of open surprise, as though being told his question was good was itself unexpected. She filed that away too. She was building, without quite knowing she was doing it, a picture of who he was, beneath the composure, and the careful manners, and the grief he was carrying. She understood, from the first morning, that this picture was going to matter more than any lesson plan she might construct, because a child who has lost the person they loved most in the world, and been sent back to school before they were ready to go, does not need more information. They need to be known. They need someone who sees them specifically, not as a child, not as a young lord, but as the particular human being they are, with all the particular fears and questions and odd angles that make up one person and not another. She did not say any of this. She said, "The birds navigate by the stars, it is believed, and also by landmarks, rivers, coastlines, the shapes of hills." He said, "How do they remember?" She said, "They are born knowing some of it. The rest they learn." He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Like us?" She looked at him. She said, "Very like us." They worked for 2 hours that morning and 3 the next day, and by the end of the first week, she had a sense of the shape of his mind, well enough to know what to do with it. She did not begin with Latin, as the previous tutors apparently had. She began with questions. She asked him what he already knew, in every subject, and she listened to the answers without correcting the gaps immediately, because the gaps told her as much as the knowledge did. She found that his understanding of natural history was excellent and intuitive. His mathematics was precise but joyless. He had been drilled in computation without anyone explaining why computation mattered. His reading was strong, but he had been given books chosen to improve his character rather than engage his mind, and he had consequently developed the habit of reading the way people endure things they cannot escape. She noted all of this. She set aside the character-building texts and went to the library. The library at Ashford Hall was a room she had been told she might use. She had been told this by Gareth Cole, in passing, with the casual generosity of someone mentioning a minor benefit, and she had registered it with the care she gave to everything that might eventually be useful. On the 3rd day of her post, while Edmund was taking his lunch in the nursery, she went to the library and stood in it for a full minute before she allowed herself to move. She had never been in a room with so many books. There were thousands of them, floor to ceiling on 3 walls, the upper shelves accessible by a rolling ladder on a brass rail, the whole room smelling of old paper and dust, and the particular closed-in warmth of a place where the fire is kept lit. She went along the shelves methodically, reading the spines, and she pulled out half a dozen books before she found what she was looking for. She came back from the library with Gaskell. She came back with Dickens. She came back with a novel by a woman called Mary Ann Evans who had published under a man's name, and whose sentences were so precise they hurt. She brought these books to Edmund's schoolroom, and put them on the shelf, and said nothing about them for 2 days. On the 3rd day he noticed them, and asked what they were. She said they were novels. He said his previous tutor had said novels were not educational. She said, "Your previous tutor was incorrect." He looked at the books, and then at her. He said, "Are you allowed to say that?" She said, "About novels?" "Yes." He almost smiled. It was the first time she had seen the shape of a smile on his face, and it lasted only a second, and it was enough. She knew, by the end of the first month, that she was going to need to be careful. Not careful in the way the housekeeper would have meant it. Careful to stay in her place, careful not to overstep, careful about the distance that was supposed to exist between a governess and the family she served. She was going to need to be careful about something else, something she recognized from the inside and had no good word for. The particular kind of care that develops between a person who is alone and a person who sees them, when they are also alone. She was not going to be the kind of governess who confused her charge's need for her with something else. She was not going to confuse her own need either. She was going to stay clear-eyed, do her job, help this child grow, and not let the warmth of being needed in a place this cold turn into something that blurred her judgment. She told herself this clearly, and meant it. She was not sure, even then, that meaning it would be sufficient. The winter at Ashford Hall settled in the way winters do in large stone houses. Not suddenly, but by degrees. Each day a little grayer and a little colder, the light going a little earlier, the corridors a little quieter. Clara found her rhythm in it. She was up at 6, dressed and ready before Edmund's knock, which came every morning at 7. They worked from 7 until 1, with a break at 10 for the brief outdoor walk she insisted on regardless of weather, because she had read enough about the health of children to know that cold air and movement were better medicine than most of what came in bottles. Edmund resisted the walks for the first week, and then stopped resisting, partly because she was immovable on the subject, and partly, she suspected, because he had discovered that the walks were the time she answered his stranger questions, the ones he seemed to save up, the ones he did not ask in the schoolroom, because the schoolroom was a room where questions should fit the subject. On walks, no subject was set. He asked her once, on a morning when the frost was thick and their breath made small clouds in the air, whether she thought it was possible that the people who died could hear what the living said about them. She considered the question seriously, as she always did. She said she did not know, but that she thought it was possible, and that in any case, the act of speaking honestly about the people we loved was good for the living, even if it did nothing for the dead. He was quiet for several paces. Then he said, "I told her I hated her, the week before she died, because she would not let me go to Hartley's house for the weekend." Clara walked beside him in the frost, and did not flinch at the confidence, and did not fill the silence with reassurance. After a moment she said, "And did she know you did not mean it?" He said, after a pause. "She said so." "She said she knew," Clara said. "Then she knew." He said nothing more about it, and they walked back to the house with their breath clouding the cold air, and she did not bring it up again, because it was his to carry, not hers, and the only job she could do was make sure he did not have to carry it alone. By December, she had established something at Ashford Hall that had not existed before she came, a kind of order around Edmund that was both firm and, in a way she worked hard to make invisible, gentle. The household watched it happen the way households watch things, with many eyes and few comments, at least in front of her. She knew the comments happened. She knew Nora the housemaid reported to the housekeeper. She knew the housekeeper wrote, periodically, to the Duke's secretary in London, where the Duke spent most of his time. She knew all of this, and she did her job, and she did not change what she was doing, because people were watching it, because she had taken the measure of the situation, and was certain she was right, and certainty about being right had always, for Clara, been sufficient to keep going. Christmas came, and brought the Duke home from London for 10 days. It was the first time she had been in his company since the interview in the cluttered room. He moved through the house with the same controlled quality she remembered. Everything contained, nothing wasted. A man who had decided at some point that he could not afford to be unguarded, and had stayed that way long past the point where it was necessary. He observed Edmund with an attention she recognized as genuine, even through the formal surface of it. He watched his son at dinner, and at the brief tea time they shared in the main parlor, and once through the doorway of the schoolroom when he did not know Clara could see him, standing in the corridor with the door half open, watching Edmund read with his feet up on the chair, and his brow furrowed, and his mouth moving slightly, the way it did when he was following something that excited him. The Duke watched this for a full minute, and then went away without speaking, and Clara went back to her marking and pretended she had not seen. On the day before the Duke returned to London, he stopped her in the corridor outside the schoolroom. He said, "Edmund slept through the night, this month." "He did not, before you came." She said nothing, because she did not know what the appropriate response was, and had learned that silence was better than an inappropriate one. He said, "You have done well." She said, "He is a remarkable child, Your Grace. The work is not difficult." He looked at her for a moment. He said, "It was difficult enough to defeat 3 other people before you." Then he went to his study, and she went back to the schoolroom, and she sat down at her desk and let herself feel, just for a moment, the satisfaction of that, plain, solid, real, before she opened the marking again. The year that followed had a particular texture to it that Clara would remember for the rest of her life. Not dramatic, not marked by events that would make sense as a summary, but rich in the small daily material of which actual lives are built. She taught Edmund French and the basics of Latin and a great deal of mathematics, and she did all of this competently, as she did everything competently. But what she was really teaching him what she understood her true work to be, was something harder to name. She was teaching him to pay attention, not in the way a tutor pays attention to a text, parsing it for meaning, in the way a human being pays attention to another human being, and to the world around them, which is the skill that makes all other skills possible. She began, in the second month of her post, a practice that she had read about in an educational pamphlet and never tried. At the end of each day, before Edmund was released to his supper and his free time, she asked him to name 3 things he had noticed that day. About the house, about the people in it, about the world outside the windows. The first week, he named things that were safe and impersonal. The frost on the lawn, the way the kitchen chimney smoked when the wind came from the east, the color of a horse in the paddock. She accepted these without comment and added her own 3 observations, which were always about people. She said she had noticed that Nora, the housemaid, always tucked her left hand behind her back when she was standing still, as though she was hiding something she carried there. She said she had noticed that Gareth Cole read through his lunch when he thought no one could see him. She said she had noticed that the boy who brought the coal scuttles to the upstairs rooms always paused on the top landing for a moment before going back down, and she thought it was because he could hear the piano from the music room from that spot, and that he liked it. Edmund looked at her when she said this last thing. He said, "How do you know?" She said, "I don't know for certain, but when I paused on that landing myself last Tuesday, I could hear it, and I stood there for a moment, before I remembered I was going somewhere." He was quiet, and she could see him filing this away. Not just the observation, but the method behind it. The idea that other people's pauses and habits and small moments of stillness had stories in them if you looked. She said nothing more about it. She let it sit. By the following month, his 3 daily observations were different. He told her that Nora's left hand was not hiding something. She always tucked it back, because she had a scar there she was self-conscious about. He told her he had found this out by simply asking, which had clearly surprised him, as much as the answer. He said the coal boy's name was Peter, and that he was 15, and that he had a mother who worked in the laundry, and a brother who had gone to work in Manchester, and that he missed his brother. He had found this out by stopping on the landing one morning and saying good morning, which had apparently been sufficiently unusual, as a thing for a young lord to do, that Peter had gone slightly wide-eyed, and then, when Edmund kept standing there, and clearly meant it as a real good morning rather than a dismissal, had talked for 5 minutes straight. Edmund told her all of this with the particular energy of someone who has discovered something they did not expect to find, and she listened and said, "And what did you say?" He said, "I said I had a brother too, once." She said, "You had a brother?" He said, "George. He died when I was 4. I don't remember him really, but I said it because it seemed like the right thing to say, like we were the same about something." Clara looked at him for a long moment. She said, "That is exactly the right thing." He looked uncertain for a moment, as though being right had surprised him, and then he went to supper. She did not tell him that he was learning something that most adults never learned at all, the ability to be genuinely present with another person, to meet them in the specific place they occupied, rather than the general place you expected them to be. She did not tell him because naming it would have changed it, turned it from a thing he was discovering into a lesson he was being taught, and the difference mattered. She just kept asking the 3 questions every evening, and kept offering her own observations, and she watched him change. The change was visible to others as well, though the others described it differently. Gareth Cole said to the housekeeper that the young lord was coming along, a phrase that covered a great deal without specifying any of it. The housekeeper said he was better behaved, which was true, but missed the point by a considerable margin. The Duke, visiting again in March, spent an evening in Edmund's company and wrote a brief note to his secretary afterward that contained the line, "Edmund seems more settled," which was the language available to him and was correct as far as it went. None of them said what was actually happening, which was that a child who had been sealed in his own grief since October was, slowly and unevenly and with great effort, opening up to the world again. That process was invisible from the outside. From the inside, from where Clara stood, talking to him every day in the schoolroom, and on the frost-hard lawn, and on the top landing, where you could hear the piano, it was the most visible thing she had ever watched. She was careful, throughout this, about her own position. She had made that promise to herself in the first month, and she kept it. She did not allow herself to become the person Edmund needed to the exclusion of everything else. because that was a dangerous shape for a governess to take, both for the child and for herself. She encouraged him to spend time with the stable boys on Saturday mornings, not because she thought the stable was particularly educational, but because she understood that she was only one human being, and that a child needed contact with more than one kind of person. She wrote twice to the Duke's secretary to suggest, carefully, that Edmund might benefit from a schoolmate visiting for a week or two during the summer. The first letter received no reply. The second received a polite acknowledgement. Nothing happened. She filed this under things she could not control, and kept going. It was in the spring, April, when the grounds had turned green again, and the days were long enough to take the afternoon lesson outside, that she made the first decision that she would, much later, identify as a departure. She had been invited, as a courtesy, to eat her meals in the servants' hall, which was the appropriate arrangement for a governess. Neither family nor quite ordinary staff, given the ambiguity of the position. She had done this without complaint for 6 months, because that was the arrangement, and complaining would have served no purpose. But she had also, from the beginning, eaten her lunch on days when the weather permitted on a bench in the kitchen garden, alone, with whatever book she was currently reading. It was her private time, the 30 minutes in the middle of the day, when she was not performing her role, or managing her presentation, but was simply herself, a woman reading a book in the sun. Edmund found this bench in April, and began, with no particular ceremony, to sit on it with her during her lunch. He brought his own food. He arranged this with the kitchen, through some mechanism she was never entirely clear on, and he sat beside her, and read his own book. He did not talk. She did not tell him to leave. She was not certain this was the right decision, but she was certain that telling a grieving child who had found a companionable silence to go away and be somewhere else would be the wrong one. So they sat on the bench in the kitchen garden and read their books and ate their lunches, and this became, over the spring and summer, such a settled habit that the kitchen staff began to leave 2 places of food out on the bench without being asked. She noticed, one afternoon in May, that the housekeeper had seen this arrangement, had stood at the kitchen window, looking out at the bench where the governess and the young lord sat together reading, and had looked at it for a long moment with an expression that Clara, catching it from the corner of her eye, could not fully interpret. Something organized and calculating. She filed it away. She did not change the bench habit. She did not think the bench habit was wrong, and she had made the rule for herself long ago that she would not alter things she believed were right, because someone with a particular expression was watching. But she noted the expression, she noted the housekeeper, she noted the long moment of calculation. She was, by that point, 2 years into her post, and she had learned a great deal about Ashford Hall that she had not known on arrival. She had learned which members of the staff were good-humored, and which were reliable, and which were both, and which were neither. She had learned the geography of the house, the service routes, the rooms that were used, and the rooms that were not, the locked door on the east corridor, that no one explained, and that she did not ask about. She had learned that the Duke paid fair wages, and expected absolute discretion, and got both, and that his occasional visits created a particular pressure in the atmosphere of the house that did not quite release until his carriage was out of the gate. She had also learned Edmund. She knew, by now, the precise register of his moods, the specific quality of the silence he put on when he was sad, versus the one he put on when he was thinking, the way his voice changed in pitch by a fraction when he was lying, which he rarely did, and the way his attention shifted physically, his whole body turning like a compass needle, toward things that genuinely interested him. She knew that he was afraid, still, of the idea that the people he loved could be taken without warning, and that he managed this fear by watching the people around him with a close and anxious attention that he had learned, from their bench in the kitchen garden, to direct into curiosity rather than anxiety. She knew that he was, underneath the composure and the manners and the early grief, a kind person. Not kind because he had been taught to perform kindness, but kind in the root sense, the sense that meant he experienced other people's situations as real and important in the way he experienced his own. The day she understood this most clearly was not a dramatic day. It was an ordinary Tuesday in September, warm still, with a late summer light that came through the schoolroom window at a low angle and made the dust in the air visible. She was marking his Latin exercises, not because Latin would be the most important thing he ever learned, but because the discipline of grammar was good for a mind, and she had made the decision that they were doing Latin properly. She looked up from the marking at some point, and found him not reading, not writing, but looking at the window. She asked what he was looking at. He was quiet for a moment, and then he said he was thinking about Peter. Peter the coal boy had been dismissed 2 weeks earlier. Clara knew this. She knew why. He had broken a lamp, a good lamp, a china lamp from the main hallway, while carrying a coal scuttle that was too heavy for one person to carry alone. She knew the lamp had been replaced, and the cost docked from Peter's wages, and then Peter had been dismissed anyway. And she had her opinion about this, and had kept it to herself, because it was not her household to run, and not her decision to make. Edmund said, "He has a mother in the laundry." Clara said yes. Edmund said, "The lamp wasn't his fault. The scuttle was too heavy." Clara put down her pen. She said, "I know." Edmund said, "Can we do something?" She looked at him for a moment. She said, "What would you like to do?" And they spent the remainder of the afternoon, the Latin exercises set aside, the window letting in the September light, talking about what could be done, and what could not, and how to tell the difference. And by the end of it, Edmund had written a careful, private letter to Gareth Cole, requesting that Peter be found another position in the household, which was not quite the same as being reinstated, but was something. The letter was in Edmund's handwriting, and in his words, though she had helped him organize the argument. Gareth Cole found Peter a position in the stables. He told Edmund so directly, which surprised Edmund, who had half expected the letter to disappear. Clara, when Edmund reported this, said that people in positions of authority were sometimes glad to be given a reason to do what they already wished they could do. Edmund thought about this. He said, "Did you know he would do it?" She said, "I thought it was probable." He said, "You made me write it anyway, even if he might not." She said, "If we only act when we are certain of the outcome, we act very rarely." He was quiet for a while after that. Then he picked up the Latin exercises and went back to them without being asked, and she picked up her marking, and the September light moved across the floor. And outside the window, the grounds of Ashford Hall were going amber with the turn of the year, and Clara Voss sat at her desk and thought that this was, against all the arithmetic of last autumn, exactly where she was supposed to be. She did not remain where she was supposed to be. That was the trouble with places that felt right. They had a way of making you forget that they were not, in the final accounting, yours. She belonged to that household in the way all employed people belong to the places where they work, conditionally, temporarily, as long as she was useful, and as long as the conditions that had placed her there remained unchanged. She knew this. She had always known this. The problem was that knowledge and feeling are different instruments, and they do not always read the same temperature. The new housekeeper arrived in the third autumn of Clara's time at Ashford Hall, and her name was Mrs. Constance Holt. She came from a large house in Northumberland, with references that were impeccable, and with the manner of a woman who had spent 20 years in positions of significant responsibility and had arrived at a settled confidence in her own judgment that was neither arrogant nor negotiable. She was efficient. She was organized. She ran the household with a precision that even Clara could admire. Menus planned to the week, inventories kept to the item. Every member of the staff aware of exactly what was expected of them and in what form. Clara got along with her perfectly well for the first 3 months. She was courteous. She stayed in her lane. She contributed nothing to gossip and took nothing from it. She thought the arrangement was working. She had not fully appreciated, though she had noted the kitchen window, noted the calculating expression, that Mrs. Holt had been watching the bench in the kitchen garden since her arrival, and drawing conclusions that had nothing to do with what Clara thought the bench was about. Mrs. Holt saw a governess who ate lunch with the young lord rather than in the servants' hall. She saw a governess who was invited by the young lord to be present at his supper on Fridays, a custom that had developed so gradually that Clara had barely noticed it becoming a custom. She saw a governess who had been observed twice going to the library unchaperoned, on her own initiative, without explicit instructions from the Duke. These facts, individually, might have been manageable. Together, they formed a picture that Mrs. Holt did not approve of, and Mrs. Holt was not the kind of woman who left pictures she disapproved of on the wall. She began, in January of the 4th year, to gather. Clara saw some of it happening and could not stop it. A word here, a question there, addressed to members of the staff in ways that sounded casual, but were not. She asked Nora whether Miss Voss ever went into rooms she was not assigned to. She asked the footman who managed the east corridor whether he had ever seen Miss Voss on that floor in the evening. She asked the young man who delivered messages between the schoolroom and the main household whether Miss Voss had ever sent anything she had not explicitly declared. These questions, asked carefully and over time, produced answers that were individually innocent and collectively damning, because that was how such questions worked. They turned ordinary behaviors into suspicious ones by placing them inside a frame of suspicion, and once the frame was established, even the most benign thing looked wrong inside it. Clara did not know the full extent of what was being gathered until it was gathered. She suspected something was happening. She was not unobservant, and the change in the quality of certain silences when she entered rooms told her something. But she was focused, in that 4th year, on Edmund, who was now 11 and had reached the age where the quality of his education would begin to determine the next stage of it. The school he would be sent to, the preparation required, the gap between what he knew and what he would be expected to know. She was working hard, and the work was absorbing, and she told herself that the atmosphere of the house was something she would deal with when there was something concrete to deal with. This was a miscalculation of the first order, as she would understand later. The letter to the Duke went from Mrs. Holt to his secretary in London in February. Clara did not see it. She did not know it had been sent. She found out about it only when, 3 weeks later, the Duke arrived at Ashford Hall, not on his regular visit schedule, but on a Tuesday morning, unannounced, and asked to see her immediately. She went to the study where he was waiting, and found him standing at the window, not sitting, which told her the conversation was not going to be comfortable. He turned when she came in, and looked at her with an expression she had never seen on his face before. Not the controlled blankness she was accustomed to, but something more complicated, an uncomfortable mixture of what might have been regret and what was certainly resolve. He said, "I have received certain information about your conduct in this household." She stood very still. He said, "Specifically, that you have developed a relationship with my son that is irregular in nature, and that you have made use of areas of this house that are not within your assigned responsibilities, without permission." He said this in the measured tone of a man who is reading from a document in his head, rather than speaking from his own experience, and she understood immediately, with a clarity that was almost painful, that he had not investigated. He had received. He had believed. He had not thought it necessary to ask her directly, or to ask Edmund, because the structure of his world was arranged so that accusations made by a senior household employee against a junior one followed a particular channel and arrived at a particular endpoint, and he was operating within that structure without examining it. She said, carefully, "May I ask what specifically has been alleged?" He said, "I think the picture is sufficiently clear from the overall account." She said, "With respect, Your Grace, it is not clear to me, because I am not aware of conducting myself irregularly at any point in my employment here." He looked at her. He said, "You have dined with Edmund on Friday evenings." She said, "At his invitation, which I assumed you were aware of." A very slight shift in his expression. He had not known. She continued, before that small shift could close again. She said, "I have used the library, to which I was given access by Mr. Cole, on your instruction, when I took the post. I have used it to select books for Edmund's education, which is my responsibility." Another shift. He had perhaps not known this either. She said, "I do not know what other specific actions have been characterized as irregular, because I have not been told, but I would welcome the opportunity to address them directly." He was quiet for a moment. Then he said something she did not expect. He said, "The relationship between you and my son has been described as one that goes beyond the proper bounds of a governess's role." She looked at him steadily. She said, "I have taught your son to read well, to think carefully, to be curious about the world, and to see other people as real. I have also been present for him consistently for 4 years, during a period in which he needed consistency very badly. If that goes beyond the proper bounds of a governess's role, then the bounds are too narrow." There was a silence. She held his gaze. He looked away first, not in defeat, but in the particular way of a man who has felt something move in him that he is not ready to let move. He said, "I think it would be better if you made arrangements to leave." She said, "Yes, Your Grace." She said it evenly, without inflection, without making him feel it, because she understood in that moment that making him feel it would not help her, and would not help Edmund, and would change nothing. She said, "I would ask that you allow me to say goodbye to Lord Edmund." He said, "I think a letter would be more appropriate." She said, "Yes, Your Grace." She turned and went to the door. He said, behind her, "I am sorry." She stopped. She did not turn around. She said, "Yes, Your Grace." And she went out. She did not write the letter that afternoon. She packed her things, which did not take long, because she had arrived with little and had acquired little in 4 years. She was constitutionally unable to accumulate, and then she sat at the desk by the window that looked over the kitchen garden and the pond, and she wrote. Not to Edmund. She wrote to Gareth Cole, who she trusted to do what she asked him to do. She wrote him 3 pages, detailing the books Edmund was working through, and where he had reached in each, the mathematical concepts still to consolidate, the Latin text she had chosen for the spring term, the particular reading schedule she recommended, and at the end, in a postscript, she said, "He needs someone to keep asking him what he has noticed. Every day, 3 things. Do not let that stop. He will understand why it matters, even if no one explains it." She folded the letter and gave it to Nora, who was red-eyed, and she picked up her bag and walked down the stairs, and out through the side door. The same side door she had entered 4 years ago, in October rain, with 4pence and a sick child's hand in hers, and she walked down the gravel drive in the February cold. She did not look back. She had made that rule for herself when she was very young. Look at what is in front of you, because the thing behind you is already done. She walked to the road and turned south, because that was where the nearest town was, and she walked, and the gray February sky sat over the fields like a lid, and she told herself she was all right, and she was, in the way that people are when they have no other option, all right. She was halfway to town before she permitted herself the thought she had been holding back. Edmund would wake up tomorrow, and she would not be there. He would knock on the door of her room at 7 in the morning, the way he had knocked every morning for 4 years, and there would be no answer, and he would stand in the corridor with his book, and he would understand. She permitted herself to feel this for exactly 30 seconds, walking on the road between the bare hedges with the cold pressing in from all sides. Then she put it away. She kept walking. The town of Milford was 8 miles from Ashford Hall, and it smelled of coal and wet cobblestone in February, and it had a coaching inn with a notice board in the window that listed lodgings available in the area. Clara stood in front of that notice board for a long time. She was cold, and she was tired, and she had approximately 9 shillings and 6pence, the wages she had not yet spent from the last quarter, which she had kept in the inner pocket of her coat, with the careful hoarding of a woman who understood that money was the difference between one kind of life and another. 9 shillings and 6pence, and the clothes she was wearing, and the bag on her shoulder, and the letter of reference she had brought with her from Ashford Hall, which Gareth Cole had placed in her bag without a word while she was packing, and which she had not yet read, but which she intended to read as soon as she had a room with a candle. The reference, when she read it that night in the narrow bed of a boarding house that cost her 18pence, was from Gareth Cole himself, not from the Duke. This told her something important about how the dismissal had been structured, not as a formal termination with cause, which would have required either an official complaint or an investigation, neither of which the Duke had pursued. He had simply made the situation untenable and asked her to leave, and in doing so, had left a gap in the paperwork that Gareth Cole had filled with his own name. The reference was good. It was careful, measured, professional, and good. It said that Miss Clara Voss had served as governess to Lord Edmund Ashford for 4 years, that her instruction had been thorough and effective, and that she had conducted herself with integrity and dedication throughout her time in the household. It did not mention the circumstances of her departure. It said she came recommended for positions of responsibility in the education of children. It was signed in Cole's clear, even hand. She read it twice. She folded it and put it back in the oilskin wrapper she had long ago made a habit of using for important documents, ever since the first journey in the rain when she had worried about the Holford letter. She lay in the narrow bed and looked at the ceiling and organized what she knew. She was 27 years old. She had been a governess for 4 years, with a good reference. She had no savings beyond 9 shillings and 6pence. She had no family to go to. Her father had died 3 years ago, quietly, in the room above a shop in Ely, that a school teacher, who had failed in his own school, had been reduced to renting, and no connections of the kind that opened doors without the door having to be knocked on first. She had her intelligence, which was considerable, and of limited market value, unless it was attached to a credential she did not have. She had the educational pamphlets she had been writing in her spare time for the past 2 years, small, careful documents about the teaching of reading, about the importance of asking children what they noticed, about the relationship between a child's curiosity and their capacity to learn, which she had sent to one small publishing company in London and received no reply. She could pursue another governess position. That was the most obvious path, and the one her reference pointed toward. She thought about it carefully. She knew what a governess's life looked like across time, the households you moved through, each one its own closed world, the relationships you formed and then were required to leave, the slow narrowing of what you were permitted to be and think and say, until you fitted yourself inside the role, like water fitting itself into a glass. She thought about Edmund, about the 4 years in the schoolroom, and the bench in the kitchen garden, and the questions that had mattered, and she thought about what it would mean to begin all of that again, in another house, with another child, and another set of boundaries. She thought she could do it. She thought she was tired. She slept, eventually, because the cold and the walking had made sleep unavoidable. In the morning she ate bread and drank tea at the boarding house table, and sat for an hour with a piece of paper, writing. She wrote a list of options, which she did not show to anyone, because there was no one to show it to. Then she wrote, at the bottom of the list, a question. What do I know how to do, that is entirely mine? She sat with this question for a long time. Then she wrote, teach. Not as a governess. Teach. It took her 4 months to find a situation that allowed for this, and those 4 months were not easy. She spent them mostly in Manchester, which she had chosen because it was large enough that a woman alone could move through it without generating constant notice, and because there were always postings for work in a city that size, even if most of the postings were not for what she needed. She worked for 6 weeks in a shirt factory, standing at a trestle table for 12 hours a day, and she registered the experience carefully in her mind, because the experience was important, and she did not want to lose the detail of it, the sound of it, the smell, the exact quality of the exhaustion, the way her back felt at 8 in the evening when she walked home to her lodgings. She was working, in her mind if not yet on paper, on a pamphlet about the education of working children, and the factory was research she had not planned to conduct but found invaluable. She left the factory when a position came up that was technically unpaid, assistant to a church schoolteacher named Mr. Vincent Peel, who ran a small school for the children of the parish in 2 rooms above a draper's shop. The position offered room and board in exchange for her time, which she understood was not a fair exchange, but was better than the factory and the lodging house. Mr. Peel was 63, nearly deaf in one ear, and had been teaching the same group of children, the same material, in the same way, for 20 years, with a degree of success that he assessed as adequate and that Clara assessed, carefully and privately, as falling somewhat short of adequate. He was not a bad man. He was simply a man who had stopped noticing his students somewhere around 1879 and had been running on habit since. She did not tell him this. She assisted him, which meant managing the younger children while he worked with the older ones, and she did this with enough quiet efficiency that within 3 weeks, he had given her the younger group entirely, and was using the freed time to sit by the window with his newspaper. She did not mind this. The younger children, aged 5 to 9, 12 of them in the first year, growing to 18 by her second, were exactly where she wanted to be. She brought to them everything she had worked out with Edmund, and everything that the factory months had added to it. She asked them 3 things they had noticed. She read to them from novels. She taught them that their questions were good, even when the questions were inconvenient, even when they interrupted the lesson, even when they were about things she did not know the answer to, at which point she told them she did not know, and they would find out together. She made them feel, each of them, like specific and interesting human beings, because that was what they were, and because she had learned from Edmund that being treated that way was not a luxury, but a requirement for real learning. Mr. Peel died in the 2nd year of her time there, quietly, in his sleep on a Tuesday night in November. The church board met to consider the school's future. Clara attended the meeting, which she had not been invited to, and sat at the back of the vestry, and waited for the moment when they paused, looking uncertain about the cost of finding a proper trained teacher, and then she spoke. She said she had been running the younger classes for 18 months. She said she could provide a written account of the children's progress. She said she was willing to take on the full school, both groups, for a stipend that was significantly less than the cost of a trained schoolmaster. She said she understood this was irregular, and that she did not have a formal teaching certificate, but that the children in the school were making good progress, and she did not think interrupting that progress served anyone. The church board looked at each other. They looked at the woman at the back of the vestry, who was wearing her second-best dress because it was more impressive than her best one, which was worn at the cuffs, and who was looking at them with the direct, patient, entirely undramatic gaze of a person who has made their case and is now simply waiting for the decision. The board chairman said he would need to think about it. Clara said she understood completely, and she thanked them for their time, and she went back to the schoolrooms above the draper's shop, and she taught the next morning's lesson as if the meeting had not happened, because if she allowed herself to wait anxiously for the decision, she would be useless in the meantime, and she could not afford to be useless in the meantime. The board said yes. It took them 2 weeks, which meant 2 weeks of not knowing, and she spent those 2 weeks in the classroom and at her desk in the evenings, writing. She had been writing for years, small pieces, observations, ideas about education, but now she wrote with more purpose. She began a proper pamphlet, not an opinion piece but a practical guide, detailed and specific, about how to teach a child to read who had not been read to at home, who came to learning without the head start of books on the shelf and stories at bedtime, and parents who used long words. She wrote from what she knew. She cited examples from her own classroom, and, without using his name, from a child she had once taught in a very different kind of room, who had needed the same things, despite having a library downstairs and a house with more windows than she could count. She finished the pamphlet in the spring. She sent it to the same small publishing company in London that had not replied to her first submission. This time they replied. They said the pamphlet was interesting and showed evidence of genuine practical knowledge, and that they could publish it as a small edition with no payment to the author, but with a copy of the finished text for her own use. She said yes immediately, because she was a practical woman who understood that being published for free was better than not being published, and that a printed pamphlet in her name was a kind of credential, and she had learned to value credentials. The pamphlet was printed in the summer, and she received 5 copies and no money, and she sent 1 copy to the church board and 1 to the educational inspector, who had visited the school the previous year, and left his card, and she put 1 copy in her drawer and kept the other 2, and she kept teaching. The school grew, not quickly, but steadily, the way things grow when they are genuinely useful, and by the 3rd year she had 22 children and 2 volunteers helping her, women from the parish who had heard about the school and wanted to be part of it, and she was teaching them how to teach with the same directness and patience she gave the children, because teaching was what she did, and she could not stop doing it, even when the people in front of her were adults. She thought about Edmund sometimes. She had thought about him every day for the first year, which she had accepted as unavoidable, and then less often in the second, and then in flashes in the third. Something would happen in the classroom. A child would say something, and she would think, Edmund would have asked that. She did not know where he was. She did not write to him, because writing would not have helped either of them, and because the clarity she had arrived at on the road to Milford, that the past was done, and what was in front of you was what mattered, had served her well enough that she intended to keep it. But she did not stop thinking about him entirely, because some things do not get smaller with time, they simply find a different shape. What she felt about Edmund was not grief, exactly, or not only grief. It was something more like the feeling of a room you cannot go back into but can still see through the window, real, warm, detailed, irrevocably on the other side of the glass. She turned 30 in the spring, and spent the birthday marking exercises while the evening light came through the schoolroom window above the draper's shop, and she ate a piece of the cake that one of the volunteer teachers had brought for her, and she drank tea, and she thought she was not unhappy. She thought this carefully, the way she thought about most things, and she arrived at the conclusion with some surprise. Not happy in the simple way. There was too much uncertainty for that, too much that was difficult. The money was too close to the edge too often, and the cough that had started in the factory had never entirely left. But not unhappy. She was doing the thing she was made to do. She was where her work was. She had learned, in the years since the rain and the road and the ditch outside Renfield, that this was what mattered. Not safety, not comfort, not even permanence. The work, and doing it honestly, and not letting the difficulty of the circumstances shrink the size of what you were trying to do. She blew out her candle that night and went to sleep, and in the morning she got up and went to the schoolroom and asked 22 children what they had noticed. What she had noticed, in those 3 years of the Manchester school, was that children who came from households with very little still wanted the same things as children who came from households with a great deal. This sounds obvious when it is stated plainly, but it was not obvious in the practice of education as she encountered it around her. The assumption underlying most of the educational provision she saw, in the church schools, in the charity institutions, in the penny schools that operated in donated rooms throughout the poorer districts of the city, was that poor children needed different things. They needed practical skills. They needed to be taught to be useful, to be orderly, to fill a specific and modest place in the world. The idea that they might need to be taught to be curious, to think about why things were the way they were, to question what they were told, and then do something with the answer. This was not the prevailing view. It was, in some quarters, actively resisted. She wrote a second pamphlet. This one was longer, 30 pages, printed the same way, distributed the same way, read by approximately the same number of people as the first. But it was more precise, more argued, more willing to say directly that the current system was failing children, not through malice, but through a poverty of imagination about what children were capable of. She cited her own classroom, where a child named William, aged 7, the son of a laundry worker, had last month produced an argument about why birds flew south that was essentially correct, and that he had arrived at entirely on his own from a series of questions he had asked and pursued across 3 days. She did not explain that she had learned to teach this way from a grieving 8-year-old in a ditch in Derbyshire, but she thought about it. The pamphlets were not famous. They were read in small numbers, filed in the records of small organizations, occasionally referenced by people who were thinking about the same questions she was thinking about. But they existed. They had her name on them. They said what she thought, clearly, and without softening. And in 1896, when an inspector from the Board of Education visited a school in Derbyshire and found among the papers on a teacher's desk a dog-eared copy of the second pamphlet with several passages underlined, and asked where it had come from, the teacher said she had been given it 3 years ago by a woman who ran a school in Manchester. The inspector noted the author's name. He did not do anything with the note immediately, but he did not throw it away. These were the small, invisible mechanisms by which Clara Voss was making her way through the world, by which a person who had no wealth and no connections, and no credential, and no powerful name attached to her own, was nonetheless leaving a thread behind her that could, if someone followed it, be traced. She did not know about the inspector and the pamphlet. She was, in 1896, managing the small crisis of a proposed increase in her school's rent by the draper below, who had received a better offer for the upper rooms and was giving her notice. She was writing to the church board again. She was managing, as she always managed, by thinking clearly about what was in front of her and then deciding what to do. She did not hear Edmund Ashford's name for 7 years after leaving Ashford Hall. She heard it first indirectly, in a newspaper, in a short piece about a parliamentary committee on conditions in industrial schools. The piece mentioned, briefly, that the committee had heard evidence from several parties, including a young nobleman who had asked questions the piece described as unusually detailed for a man of his background. The name was there, Edmund Ashford, now the Duke of Carlisle, following the death of his father the previous spring. She was 31. She read the name twice, and then folded the newspaper and put it in the pile for the schoolroom, where the older children used old newspapers to practice their reading. She did not unfold it again, but she knew the name was there, and the knowing sat in her the way things sit when they have been waiting for a long time for a reason to settle. She moved the school that winter when the draper's notice expired. She moved it to a larger space, a converted stable belonging to a retired mill owner named Mr. Harold Greer, who had heard about the school from his granddaughter, who attended it, and who offered the space for a very reduced rent, on the understanding that in 10 years, when the granddaughter was grown, he hoped the school she had attended would still be there. Clara said she could make no promises about 10 years, but she would do her best, which was the most honest thing she could say, and which Mr. Greer, who had grown up with enough people who said more than that and delivered less, appeared to respect. She shook his hand. She moved her 27 children to the stable, which she had spent a month making fit for purpose, with the help of the 2 volunteer teachers, and 4 of the older children's fathers. And the school in the stable was larger and better lit, and had a small yard at the back, where you could go outside when the weather allowed. By 1899, she had 31 children, and 3 paid helpers, and a waiting list. She also had a cough that had moved from intermittent to regular over the winter, and Dr. Breyer, the local doctor, a man of about 50 with a gentle manner and a direct way of saying difficult things, had told her in February that she needed to be careful, that the cold and the damp were not her friends, that she needed to sleep and eat properly, and not work 17-hour days. She said she would try. She tried moderately hard and worked 14-hour days instead, which she told herself was an improvement. The second pamphlet had been republished by a slightly larger press in 1898, after the educational inspector, she still did not know his name, had apparently written to the original publisher asking about the author. The second edition reached 200 copies, which was not a great number, but was 200 times what it had been. She received, for the first time, a small payment. She used it to replace the schoolroom stove, which had developed a crack. She was, in all the important ways, building something. Not quickly, not with any fanfare, not in a way that would have been visible to anyone, observing from a distance. From a distance, she looked like a woman who had made the best of a reduced situation. A woman without the right credentials or connections, who had carved out a small, useful corner of the world, and was living in it as responsibly as the corner allowed. What she actually was, though the difference was invisible from the outside, was someone who had decided very clearly what she believed, and then built everything she did on top of that belief. The belief was not complicated. It was only this: every child who comes through a door wanting to learn deserves to be treated as though what they want matters. The rest, the pamphlets, the school, the volunteer teachers, the waiting list, the stove she replaced with the payment for the pamphlet, was all in service of that one simple, costly, endlessly demanding conviction. She turned 35 in the spring and went to the schoolroom as usual, and the children had made a card for her, which surprised her, and she held it for a moment with an expression that her assistant teacher later described, privately, as the most unguarded thing she had ever seen on Clara Voss's face. Then Clara put the card on her desk and said "Good morning, everyone," and began the lesson. The letter that changed everything arrived on a Wednesday morning in October of 1900. It was delivered by the regular post, which came to the converted stable that had become the school's home, and it was addressed in a hand Clara did not recognize. Precise, educated, formal. The kind of handwriting that comes from someone who has been taught to write for official purposes. She was in the middle of a reading lesson with 7 children when the letter was brought in by her assistant, a young woman named Harriet Owens, who had started as a student helper 2 years ago and was now paid half a teacher's wage and was worth considerably more than that. Harriet put the letter on the corner of Clara's desk without interrupting the lesson, and Clara saw it there and noticed the seal on the back, a dark red wax seal, with an embossed device she did not immediately recognize, and felt something shift in her chest, in a way that was not quite fear and not quite expectation, but was made of both. She finished the lesson. She heard the children read in turn, corrected 2 misreadings and praised 5 good ones, set them all a writing task in their exercise books, walked around the room once to ensure everyone had a pencil that was working, and then sat down at her desk and opened the letter. She read it 3 times, because the first time she was not sure she was understanding it correctly, and the second time she thought she had understood, but needed to go back to the beginning to confirm, and the third time she was certain, and sat with the certainty for a moment, while around her 7 children scratched their exercise books with their pencils. The letter was from a firm of London solicitors. It informed her that their client, unnamed, described only as a private individual, had been made aware of her educational work through certain published materials, and had asked them to make contact with a view to discussing a matter of potential interest to her. They requested a meeting at a date and place convenient to her. They were available to come to Manchester if she preferred. They said the matter was of a nature that they could not discuss in writing, but that she would not find the meeting a waste of her time. The letter was signed by a senior partner. It was written on paper of a quality that Clara had not seen close up since she had lived in a house with a library. She looked at the seal on the back of the envelope for a long time. She thought about who might have sent it. She thought about the inspector and the pamphlet and the republishing. She thought about the educational reform discussions she had heard were happening in certain circles. She considered the possibility that this was a legitimate professional approach, and the possibility that it was something else entirely, and she examined both with equal steadiness and arrived at a decision. She would go to the meeting. She would go because, even if it turned out to be nothing, the act of going was free. and she could not afford to leave things that might matter unexplored. She wrote back the same day, accepting the meeting. The meeting was set for 3 weeks hence, at a hotel in Manchester. She dressed for it with the care she gave to things that mattered. The better dress, which was now the only dress that was fully intact. The good shoes she kept for court hearings. She had begun attending the quarterly sessions of the Manchester Board of Education, which required good shoes. Her hair put up with the precision of someone who had learned to make a small number of good things do a great deal of work. She arrived at the hotel at the agreed time, and was shown to a private meeting room where 2 men in very good suits were already waiting. One of them was the solicitor, a measured man named Frederick Alderton, who rose to shake her hand with the grave professional courtesy of someone who had been doing this for decades. The other man was younger, and he did not rise immediately, and Clara, looking at him across the width of a hotel meeting table, felt the room move slightly around her, in the way rooms move when reality does something that the mind needs a moment to catch up with. He was not the boy she remembered. Of course he was not. 12 years had passed, and the boy had been 11 when she last saw him. And what was sitting across the table from her was a young man of 23, with Edmund's dark hair and Edmund's particular quality of attention, the way his whole being oriented toward you when he was looking at you, that she had catalogued and named and thought about through 12 years of other mornings. He had grown into his face in the way people grow into faces that are made for them. The structure that had been almost too angular at 11 was exactly right at 23. He was looking at her with an expression that was controlled but not cold, and under the control, visible to her because she had spent 4 years learning to read his face, was something complicated, relief and guilt, and something else that she had no name for. She said, "Good morning, Lord Edmund." She said it evenly, in exactly the voice she used in the schoolroom. He said, "It is the Duke now. But Edmund, please." She sat down across the table from him, because sitting was what the situation required, and she looked at him, and she waited, because she had always been better than he was at waiting, and she was not going to let the strangeness of the moment make her worse at it. He spoke first, which was also how it had always been between them. He said, "I have been looking for you." She said, "I know that solicitors' letters are not generally sent by accident." He said, "It took longer than it should have." "I am sorry." She looked at him. She said, "You don't need to apologize for the time. Tell me what you want to say." He pressed his lips together, the old gesture, the one she recognized, the one that meant he was organizing something, and then he said it. He said he had come to know, in the years since she left, exactly what her dismissal had consisted of. A set of accusations from a housekeeper who had been operating on assumptions rather than evidence, presented to a father who had not investigated, and had not asked, and had made a decision that suited the structure of his world rather than the facts of the situation. He said his father had told him this himself, near the end, when the Duke was ill, and was doing the accounting that people do when they understand that time is running short. His father had said, "I did not treat Miss Voss well." Edmund had sat with this information for 3 years, since the deathbed conversation, and the weight of it had shaped a great deal of what he had decided to do with the title, and the estate, and the power that came with them. Clara listened to all of this without moving. She said, when he had finished, "What do you want to do about it?" He said, "I want to do something real. Not a payment, not a formal apology, unless you want one." She said, "I don't want a formal apology." He said, "I thought not." He looked at her steadily. He said, "I read your pamphlets." She said, "Both of them?" He said, "I found both of them. The second one first. Someone on my household staff had a copy. Then I found the first one. Then I found out what you are doing in that stable." She said, "It is a very well-converted stable." He almost smiled, the same shape as the almost smiles she remembered, in the same corner of the same face. He said, "I want to make it a school." She looked at him. She said, "Explain." And he did. He laid it out, with Frederick Alderton occasionally adding a legal clarification, and Edmund making room for those clarifications without losing the thread. He had learned to work with solicitors, she could see, in the way he had learned everything, by actually paying attention to the people who knew what he did not. And the plan he described was not a gesture. It was a thing with foundations. It involved the purchase of the property she was currently using, and the 2 adjacent properties, which would provide space for a properly built school building with proper facilities. It involved an endowment, a sum of money held in a legal trust, the income from which would fund the school's operations indefinitely, including salaries for teaching staff and maintenance of the building. It involved her name. The school would be called the Voss Foundation, and she would be its founder, which was legally accurate since she had founded it, in a stable, with nothing. 12 years after leaving a house where she was not permitted to stay. She looked at him for a long time when he had finished. She said, "Why foundation? I am not a known name." He said, "You will be." She said, "That is not a reason to structure it that way." He said, "It is named for the person who built it, which is the truth. I am providing the money. You did the building. The name is accurate." She said, "You are providing the money because you feel responsible for what happened." He said, "Yes." She said, "That is not a good enough reason to build a school." He said, "No, the school is a good enough reason to build a school. I am providing the money because of what happened. Those are two different things." She sat with this for a moment and found she could not argue with it, which was itself familiar. He had grown into a man who said things that could not be argued with, and she thought she knew where he had learned to do that. And the thought made her chest feel something complicated and warm. She said, "I want to run it exactly as I have been running it." He said, "Yes." She said, "I want to hire the people I choose and teach in the way I choose, and no committee of governors telling me that my methods are irregular." He said, "The trust deed will specify academic independence." Frederick, the solicitor, confirmed this with a nod and a precise addendum about the relevant clause. She said, "I want the teachers paid properly." He said, "More than properly." She said, "And I want a pension, not for sentiment, because a woman who has no security spends part of her mind on security instead of the work, and I want my full mind on the work." He said, "It is already in the deed." She looked at the solicitor, who confirmed it with a brief, measured nod. She looked at the documents that were laid out on the table in front of her. She looked at Edmund, who was watching her with the steady attention that had not changed at all in 12 years, waiting. She said, "I need to read the documents properly before I sign anything." He said, "Of course. Take as long as you need." She gathered the documents and put them in her bag. She stood. He stood. She held out her hand and he shook it, and she noticed that his grip was exactly as she would have predicted from the boy she knew. Firm, without performance. The handshake of someone who means what they are doing. She said, "Thank you." He said, "You spent 8 shillings. She said, "That was 13 years ago." He said, "I know. I have been calculating the interest." She left the hotel and walked back through Manchester in the October afternoon, and she did not go directly home. She walked for a long time, through streets she knew well by now, past the factory where she had stood at a trestle table, past the first boarding house, past the church where the vestry meeting had happened, through the district where the school was. She walked the way she walked when she needed to think, which was steadily and without particular destination, letting the thinking happen around the walking rather than sitting down with it. By the time she arrived back at the stable, the afternoon light was going, and Harriet Owens had locked up and left the key with the caretaker next door as arranged. She let herself in and sat in the empty schoolroom, with 31 children's drawings on the walls and 31 exercise books on the shelves, and she sat there for a while in the quiet. She took the documents out of her bag. She read them properly, all the way through, in the fading light, and then went to the window for the parts where the light was insufficient. The deed was exactly as described. Everything he had said was there. The independence clause was clear. The pension clause was specific. The naming of the founder was unambiguous. She read the endowment figure twice, because she wanted to be certain she was reading it right, and then she sat back in the teacher's chair and looked at the drawings on the walls. She thought about what it meant, not the money, not the building, not even the name, though all of those mattered. She thought about what it meant that someone had looked for her, that a person she had known at the worst point of his young life, whom she had left without a goodbye because she had not been permitted one, had spent years tracking the thread she had left behind, the pamphlets, the school, the inspector who had noted her name, and had arrived, finally, across a hotel table, with a plan that was entirely about her work and not at all about the obvious gesture. He could have sent money. He could have sent a letter of apology. He could have done any number of things that would have been easier and faster and would have served the need he felt without requiring him to understand what she had actually built. He had not done any of those things. He had read the pamphlets. He had found out about the school. He had built the response around the work, because he had been taught, by someone who had meant it, that the work was the point. She signed the documents that evening. She took them back to the hotel the next morning, and Frederick Alderton witnessed the signatures, and Edmund was not there. He had returned to London the previous night, and she was glad he was not there, because the witnessing was a practical matter, and she did not want it to be something else. She shook Alderton's hand and went back to the stable for the morning lesson, and said good morning to 31 children, and asked them what they had noticed, and she started planning the new building. The building took 18 months from the signing of the deed to the opening of the doors. Clara was involved in every stage of it, which the architect, a practical man named George Fielding, who had spent most of his career building mill workers' housing, and was therefore, as she put it to him at their first meeting, ideally placed to understand what this school required, initially found unusual, and eventually found invaluable. She knew what she needed. She had been working in 2 rooms above a draper's, and then in a converted stable, and she had learned from both what a classroom required in terms of light, air, warmth, and the particular relationship between space and how children felt in it. She told Fielding that she wanted large windows on the south wall of the main room, because cold light from the north made concentration difficult, and light from the south in winter was the closest thing to warmth that a budget could provide. She told him she needed a separate small room for children who were having a hard day and needed to sit somewhere quiet without being excluded from the school entirely. She told him she needed the door handles at a height accessible to a 5-year-old, because a door you cannot open yourself is a message about who the space belongs to, and she wanted the space to belong to the children. Fielding put all of this in the plans without comment, and she respected him for that. He came back to her 3 weeks later with a revised set of drawings that incorporated everything she had said, plus several additions of his own that showed he had thought about what she was trying to achieve and had generated ideas that she would not have thought of herself. She told him the additions were good. He said the project was unlike anything he had worked on before. She said that was probably not a problem. He said he did not think it was a problem at all. During the 18 months of construction, she continued to run the school in the stable, which the endowment trust now paid for at its proper cost. And she continued to teach, and to ask the 3 daily questions, and to work through the waiting list, which had grown to 41 children by the time the new building opened. She hired a second qualified teacher, a woman named Frances Brent, who had a formal teaching certificate, and who Clara interviewed in the converted stable on a cold Tuesday morning, and who answered every question with the directness and the absence of self-importance that Clara had decided were the only qualities she could not supply with training. Frances Brent started the following Monday. Edmund came for the opening of the school building. He did not make a speech. He had written to her to ask whether he should, and she had written back to say that speeches at school openings were for the people making the speech, not for the children who were going to be learning in the building, and that if he wanted to do something that would matter, he could come early and carry chairs. He arrived at 8:30 on the morning of the opening, with one of the solicitor's clerks, and without any of the other trappings she might have expected, and he carried chairs for 2 hours, alongside the school caretaker, and George Fielding's foreman, and 2 of the fathers from the school, and he did it without drawing attention to himself, which was harder than it sounded, given who he was and what he looked like. She watched him, briefly, from across the new main room, while he and the caretaker moved a heavy table and discussed the best angle for it relative to the windows. He was entirely comfortable, entirely present, talking to the caretaker with the same quality of full attention he had always given to the person in front of him, and she thought, that is the thing. That is the thing she had tried to put in the pamphlets without quite being able to name, the practice of actually seeing the person you were with, the refusal to be in the room while really being somewhere else in your own head. It was so simple, and so rare, that she had been writing around it for years, without ever managing to say it plainly, and here it was, in the body of a man carrying a table, 30 years old, the Duke of Carlisle. The school opened at 10. There were 62 children, which was 21 more than the stable had held, and they came in with the particular combination of wariness and excitement that children bring to new spaces, and Clara stood at the front of the main room and looked at them all, the small ones who were starting, and the old ones who had been in the stable, and who had a proprietary pride about the new space that she found rather wonderful. And she said good morning, and they said good morning back, and she said, let us begin. What have you noticed this morning? Edmund left after the opening, back to London on the afternoon train, and Clara walked him to the end of the road where the cab was waiting. They stood in the October air, and he said, "It is exactly what I thought it would be." She said, "You did not know what it would be." He said, "I knew because you described it. In the second pamphlet, third section, the part about the light from the south." She looked at him. She said, "You read it that carefully." He said, "I read both of them 3 times. She said, "Why?" He said simply, "Because you wrote them." The cab was waiting. He got in, and she stood in the road and watched it go, and she thought that he had been right about one thing. They were different things. His reasons and the school. And she was glad of the school. And she was glad of his reasons. And she was surprised to find that both could be true at the same time, without one diminishing the other. She went back to the school and spent the rest of the day organizing the new storeroom and labeling the exercise bookshelves and showing Frances Brent where the emergency medicines were kept and talking to 62 children about what they had noticed. The new building smelled of fresh plaster and new wood and the particular excitement that gathers in a space the first time it is used for its purpose. She breathed it in while she worked. She was 36 years old. She had a school that was hers, and a pension, and the independence clause in the deed, and 62 children, and 2 good teachers, and a cough that was probably going to be a permanent feature of her life, and a man she had found in a ditch, and not kept, who had found her again, and given her the means to do what she was going to do anyway, only better. She thought about all of this while she labeled the exercise bookshelves, and she thought it was the best accounting she had ever done, and she went home to her flat above the chandler's shop, and ate her supper and slept. The years that followed the opening of the Voss Foundation School had a different quality from the years before it. Clara would not have called them easier. They were not easier in the practical sense, because running a proper school with a proper staff, and 62 children growing toward 100, was harder work than running an improvised one, and the complexity of the administration alone was a new and particular kind of demand. But they had a solidity to them that the years before had not had. The difference between standing on ground and standing on something you have assembled from whatever you could find. The Voss Foundation was ground. She had built it from improvised materials, yes, but it was solid now, legal, endowed, named, real in the way only things that have been properly founded are real. And working on solid ground, even when the work is harder, produces a different kind of tiredness than working on improvised ground. It is the good tiredness, the kind you wake up from. She woke up from it every morning. She woke up in her flat above the chandler's shop on Marsden Street, the flat that was part of the endowment, that she lived in as a matter of right rather than precarity. And she made her tea, and she dressed, and she walked the 6 minutes to the school, and let herself in with her own key. She was always the first one there. She had been always the first one since the days in the stable, and she saw no reason to change it. The first 15 minutes of every day, before anyone else arrived, were hers. She walked through the rooms. She looked at the children's work on the walls. She stood at the window of the main room that looked south and watched the light come in the way she had described to the architect. And she did her thinking. The thinking, in those years, was mostly about the next child. The waiting list had reached 87 by 1903. She had hired Frances Brent and then a man named Alfred Cartwright, who had been a teacher in a private boys' school and had left it, as he put it, because he found the boys there less interesting than the boys he met outside it, which was the kind of thing Clara appreciated, being said plainly. She had hired 2 more assistant teachers, both women from the local area, who had shown the thing she looked for before anything else, the ability to be interested in a child's answer, even when the answer was unexpected. She had developed, over the years of the stable and the years of the school, a quite specific method of interviewing teaching candidates that involved asking them to watch her teach a lesson for 20 minutes, and then asking them what they had noticed. The candidates who noticed the curriculum, what she was teaching, were usually not who she was looking for. The candidates who noticed the children, who was confused, who was bored, who had lit up at a specific moment and why, those were the ones she hired. Edmund wrote to her once a year. He did not write often, because he was, she could see from the newspapers, and from what she could piece together, doing a great deal. The estate, the parliamentary work, the various committees and causes that he had taken on, with the particular intensity of a person who has a late start and knows it. His letters were not long. They were always about the school, always specific. He had heard something, or read something, or encountered a question in his work that connected to something in her pamphlets, and he wanted to know what she thought. She wrote back with the same specificity. They did not write about themselves or about their shared history, or about the gap of 12 years, or about the hotel meeting room. They wrote about the work, which was the thing they had in common, and the thing that mattered. And this suited both of them, without either of them having stated it as an arrangement. He sent her a copy of the Parliamentary Committee report on industrial schools in 1902, with a brief note. See page 47. On page 47, there was a recommendation about the teaching methods used in factory schools, citing recent published work on alternative approaches, and naming her pamphlets in the footnote. The recommendation was not radical. Parliamentary committee recommendations rarely were, but it was specific, and it used language that came directly from the second pamphlet, which meant someone on that committee had read it carefully. She sent him back a note that said, "Saw page 47. Good." She did not say what she meant by good, because he would know. In 1903, the solicitors wrote to her again. This time the letter was from Frederick Alderton himself, not a junior partner, and it said that certain additional arrangements had been made to the trust, arrangements that increased the endowment's income by a meaningful amount, and that these were the result of a decision by the settlor, who had directed that she be informed, but not that she be consulted, as it was his money to do with as he saw fit, but that she should know. Clara read this, and recognized that Edmund had not consulted her, because he had known she would protest, and had made the decision anyway, and had told Alderton to tell her in a way that was honest, without inviting the argument. She sat with this for a while. She considered whether to write and protest anyway. She decided not to, on the grounds that the money would go directly to expanding the school, which she needed to do, and that arguing about the mechanism of a gift when the gift was needed served primarily her own pride. She was not willing to spend the children's resources on her own pride. She expanded the school. She used the additional endowment income to convert the building next door, another purchase, another Alderton letter, into a reading room that was open after school hours and on Saturday mornings to the families of the children who attended. This was an idea she had been sitting on for 2 years, based on the observation that a child who learned to love reading at school, but went home to a house with no books, was fighting against the current. She put books in the reading room, donated, collected, bought with a budget Alderton managed, and she put a kettle and a table and chairs, and she hired a woman named Meg Thorpe, who was the mother of one of her students, to manage the room 3 afternoons a week, and Meg Thorpe, who had taught herself to read at 32, using an old Bible and a dictionary, turned out to be the best person Clara could have put in that room, because she understood, from the inside, what it meant to want something and not have the means to get it. The reading room was immediately used. The day it opened, 11 adults came. The day after, 7. Within a month it was averaging 12 adults per session, and the kettle was running constantly, and Meg Thorpe had started an informal reading circle that met on Thursday afternoons, that Clara, on the one occasion she sat in on it without announcing herself, found to be one of the most interesting conversations she had ever overheard. 5 adults reading the same chapter of a novel, and arguing, with full feeling and no self-consciousness, about whether the main character had done the right thing. She sat in the corner for 20 minutes, and then quietly left, because she did not want to change the room by being in it with her teacher's presence. She was 40 years old. The school had 93 children and 5 teachers. The reading room had Meg Thorpe, and a kettle, and a growing collection of books, and the best Thursday afternoon in the area. The cough was worse in winter, better in summer, and she managed it with the practical indifference of someone who knows that a thing is there, and will remain there, and the only question is how much of your attention you give it. She gave it as little as possible. She kept working. She received, in the spring of 1904, a letter that was different from all the solicitor letters and all Edmund's annual letters. It was from a woman named Agnes Fowler, who identified herself as an administrator with the Manchester Board of Education, and who said she was writing in a personal capacity, not an official one, because she had been trying to find a way to say something for 2 years, and had finally decided that saying it personally was better than not saying it at all. What she wanted to say was that she had been reading Clara's pamphlets since the first one was published, and that she had been watching the Voss Foundation for 3 years, and that she believed what Clara was doing was important in a way that extended beyond one school in one city. She said she had contacts in 3 other cities who were trying to do similar things. She said she wondered whether Miss Voss had ever considered sharing her methods in a more systematic way, not just in pamphlets, but in person, with people who were trying to build what she had built. Clara read this letter twice, which was her habit with important things, and then she put it on her desk under a paperweight and let it sit there for a week while she decided what to do with it. The week included 6 days of lessons, 2 meetings with the board of the trust, a requirement of the deed that she had agreed to without enthusiasm but honored with diligence, 1 conversation with Alfred Cartwright about a student who was falling behind and needed more attention than the current timetable allowed, and 1 very long Thursday afternoon in the reading room with Meg Thorpe, going through the book donations that had arrived that week and sorting them by reading level. At the end of the week, she picked up Agnes Fowler's letter, read it a 3rd time, and wrote a reply. She said she had considered the question Agnes Fowler raised and thought it was a good one. She said she had been trying to work out how to say things that were in the pamphlets but had not made it fully onto the page. Things that were better demonstrated than described, better shown through doing than explained through text. She said she was willing to meet with the contacts Agnes Fowler mentioned, if those contacts were interested. She said she was not, at this stage, leaving the school for any extended period, because the school was the point, and everything else was in service of it. She said she could make herself available 1 day a month, if that was sufficient, and that if it was not sufficient, she was sorry, but that was what she had to offer. She sent the letter and went back to the classroom, and she did not think about it again until Agnes Fowler's reply arrived 2 weeks later saying, 1 day a month is precisely what she had hoped for. What followed was slow and accumulative, as real changes usually are. Agnes Fowler introduced her, over the next year, to 6 people in 5 cities who were attempting versions of what she was doing. 2 of them had read her pamphlets. 1 had read them 4 times and had dog-eared copies she showed Clara with a kind of reverence that Clara found both touching and faintly embarrassing. She went to Sheffield in November and spent a day in a small school there, watching and asking questions, and then, in the afternoon, sitting with the teacher and the administrator and talking through what she saw. She went to Leeds in January and did the same. She went to Birmingham in March. In each city she found people who were working hard on not quite enough, and who had questions she could sometimes answer, and questions she could not, and the ones she could not answer she took home and thought about, and sometimes the thinking produced something she had not thought before, which she then tried to write down, which was how her 3rd pamphlet began. Not as a decision to write, but as the accumulation of questions she had been asked, that she had not been able to answer quickly, which meant they needed the longer treatment that writing requires. She was working very hard. She knew this. She was working harder than was good for her, and the doctor had said so twice that year, and Harriet Owens had started leaving cups of tea on her desk without being asked, which was Harriet's way of saying the same thing without saying it. She was not going to stop working. She was going to work exactly as hard as the work required, which was more than was good for her, because she had never had the luxury of working only as hard as was comfortable, and she was not going to start now. She made this clear to herself and to her body, and to the cough, and to the doctor when he mentioned it a 3rd time, and the doctor said he understood, and she respected him for not saying it a 4th time. She wrote at night, after the school was closed, and Harriet had gone home, and the reading room was locked. She sat at the desk in the main classroom, because the desk at home felt too small for this work, and the classroom felt right in the particular way that places where you spend your real effort feel right, and she wrote by lamplight, and the night air pressed at the south-facing windows, and the children's drawings watched her from the walls, and she wrote the things she had been trying to say for 20 years, in a language plain enough that anyone who needed it could use it. The 3rd pamphlet was finished in the autumn of 1905, and was longer than the others, 52 pages, which was not long by the standards of the educational literature that existed, but was long by the standards of what she had previously allowed herself. She sent it to the same press that had published the 2nd edition of the 2nd pamphlet, and they wrote back promptly saying they wanted to publish it as a proper edition, with a modest advance, which was the first time she had been offered money for the writing, rather than after the fact of its being read. She accepted. She used the advance to buy books for the reading room. The 3rd pamphlet was called What the Child is Asking. It argued, across its 52 pages, that the question a child asked was not an interruption to the teaching, but was itself the most important data the teacher had about where the child was and what they needed. It argued this with specific examples, with references to educational research she had spent 3 months gathering from the library of the Manchester Board of Education, and with the particular precision of someone who had been thinking about one thing for a very long time and had finally found the language. It was, Compared to the earlier pamphlets, almost a different kind of document, more confident, more systematic, more willing to make the argument as large as the argument actually was. Agnes Fowler read it before it was published, and wrote to say it was the most important thing Clara had written. Clara read Agnes Fowler's letter at her desk in the early morning, and then wrote back to say she was still not sure about the section on younger children, and asked for Agnes's thoughts on 3 specific paragraphs. Agnes replied with 4 pages of close notes. Clara spent a Saturday afternoon going through the notes and incorporated half of them into the final version, which went to the press in November. It was published in January of 1906. She received 6 copies and a small payment, and went back to the classroom. Within 3 months, the press had told her they needed to print more copies because the first edition was gone. By summer, the reprinting had happened. By the following spring, Agnes Fowler was writing to say that someone at the Board of Education in London had cited the pamphlet in a formal report, not in a footnote this time, but in the body of the text, in a recommendation that had been adopted. Clara read this and put the letter in her files, and went to the classroom and taught a morning of reading to 24 children aged 5 to 8, and asked them what they had noticed, and wrote down 3 of the answers because they were extraordinarily good. She did not write to Edmund about the pamphlet. She did not need to. He wrote to her first, in February, a letter that was slightly longer than his annual ones, and that contained, in the middle of 2 pages of questions about the school's expansion plans, a single sentence: "The 3rd pamphlet is the best thing you have written, and the best thing I have read, since the books you gave me in the schoolroom." She read this sentence, and then read the rest of the letter, and then went back, and read the sentence again. She wrote back, addressing all the questions about expansion, in full detail, and at the end, in a postscript, she said, "Thank you for the 3rd sentence of page 2. He would know which sentence. She hired 2 more teachers in 1906, and began planning a proper library room for the school, which was now full to its current capacity, and needed to grow or start a waiting list for the waiting list. She applied to the trust for the funds, and received them without delay, which she still found faintly surprising, even after years of having access to money that was allocated specifically for this purpose. She had spent too long in the condition of not having it to fully lose the instinct of scarcity. She managed this instinct consciously, noted it when it arose, distinguished between the cases where caution was genuinely necessary and the cases where it was only habit, and tried to make her decisions from the evidence rather than from the old anxiety. The library room was built in the summer. The school now had 108 children and 7 teachers, and Meg Thorpe in the reading room, and a library that held 412 books, which Agnes Fowler had helped her choose from a list they had spent 2 evenings compiling at Clara's kitchen table. And Clara stood in the finished library on the morning it opened, and breathed in the smell of the books, and thought about her father's schoolroom that had smelled of chalk and old paper, and about the library at Ashford Hall that she had stood in for a full minute before allowing herself to move, and about what it meant that the smell was the same, and that she was on this side of it now, the side that owned the books instead of the side that was permitted to use them. She was 41. She was doing the work she was built for. She was tired, in the good way. The cough was a fact of her life that she managed without drama. Edmund wrote once a year, and she wrote back. Agnes Fowler was her closest friend, which surprised her sometimes because she had not sought a friend, and had not expected to find one in a Board of Education administrator, in a brown coat with a direct manner, and 4 pages of notes on a section of a pamphlet. She had not expected many of the things that had happened. She had made plans, and the plans had failed, and the failures had led her somewhere the plans had not imagined, and the somewhere the failures had led her was better than what the plans had aimed at. She thought about this sometimes, on the walks she still took in the middle of the day, the walks that had been the bench in the kitchen garden, and were now a circuit of the block around the school and the reading room. She thought that this was something she should probably write down. She thought she would get to it eventually, when there was time. There was never time. She went back to the classroom. The day the educational inspector arrived to make a formal assessment of the Voss Foundation School, Clara was in the middle of teaching a lesson about fractions to 11 children aged 9 and 10, using 12 apples, and the question of how to share them, if there were 11 people and one of them was twice as hungry as the others. The inspector arrived at the door during this lesson, knocked, and put his head in. She turned and said, "Come in, please, and sit at the back. We are in the middle of something." He came in and sat at the back, and watched the lesson to its conclusion, which was 15 minutes more, and involved a genuine mathematical argument between two children that Clara moderated, with the patience and complete absence of condescension that had always been the thing about her teaching that was hardest to learn from description and most obvious in person. The inspector took notes the whole time. Afterward, when the 11 children had gone out for their dinner, he said to her that he had visited 43 schools in the previous 2 years, and that this lesson was unlike any he had observed. She said, "In what way?" He said, "In the way the children were arguing." She said, "They were wrong about the fractions, but the argument was good." He looked at her. He said, "That is exactly it." She said, "Yes." They sat and talked for an hour after that, and the inspector's report, when it was filed 6 weeks later, contained a passage that was later quoted in 3 separate discussions of elementary education reform, and which said, in the careful language of official reports, that the Voss Foundation School represented a model of child-centered learning that achieved measurably better results than standard methods while operating on a comparable budget, and that its methods merited serious consideration for wider adoption. Clara received a copy of the report and read it and filed it. She did not mark the occasion in any particular way. She went to the classroom the next morning and asked the children what they had noticed. They told her 4 things between them that she had not herself noticed, which was as good a result as she had ever had, and she told them so, and they were pleased. And the morning proceeded, and the October light came through the south-facing windows, the way she had specified to the architect, and the school smelled of children and chalk, and the particular warmth of a room that is used for something it was made for. By 1908, the cough had moved from a background fact to a foreground one, and Dr. Breyer had stopped being diplomatic about it. He used, at the January appointment, the words chronic and cumulative, and he said the lung condition that had begun in the factory years and been worsened by the winters in the stable, and then in the older parts of the school building, before the new premises were finished, had reached a point where it was going to be a constant variable in her health, rather than an occasional problem. He said she needed to rest more, which she heard and acknowledged. He said she needed more sleep, which she also acknowledged. He said the worst months for her would be the cold ones, November through February, and that she needed to take particular care in those months. She said she understood, and she did understand, in the same way she understood other facts about the world that were true and inconvenient and had to be worked around. She was 43 years old and had a school with 119 children and did not have the option of spending November through February at a reduced pace, because November through February was when the children needed to be there the most, and when the school needed her judgment the most, and when the things that went wrong, the illnesses, the absences, the domestic crises that rippled out into a child's ability to concentrate, were most frequent. She took to wearing an extra layer, and drinking more tea, and making sure she was home, and in bed by 9, rather than 10. And this was the full extent of what she was able to do about it. And she did it without complaint, because complaint was a waste of time and warmth. Edmund's annual letter that year came in March, rather than the usual November, and it was longer than usual. He was writing from London, where the parliamentary session was in progress, and the letter was full of the work he was doing. 3 different committees, a debate he had been preparing for, a piece of legislation about conditions in industrial schools that had been in process for 2 years, and was finally close to a vote. He wrote about this work in the specific, detailed way he wrote about everything, without any of the performance of importance that Clara associated with people who had recently discovered they had power. He did not say, "I am doing important things." He said, "We spent 4 hours on the wording of Clause 7, because the wording matters, and nobody wanted to agree about what it meant." She recognized this as the residue of a habit she had spent 4 years building in a boy who asked why. At the end of the letter, almost as a postscript, he said, "I am told by Alderton that you have not submitted a claim for the travel allowance that is part of the trust deed. I am also told you have been making visits to schools in other cities on your own expense. This is the part of the arrangement that I will not accept quietly. Please use the travel allowance. It is in the deed for a reason." She read this and recognized immediately that he had been told by Alderton because Alderton reviewed the trust accounts and noticed what was not claimed. She also recognized that he was right. The travel allowance was in the deed. She had signed the deed, and not claiming it was a residual instinct from the years when she managed everything on nothing and had not fully updated to the current situation. She wrote back about the parliamentary work and the legislation and Clause 7, and she submitted a claim for the travel allowance for the previous 2 years, and she did not make the mistake of not submitting it again. She was not going to let pride cost the school anything, including her own time. Agnes Fowler came to the school for lunch on a Thursday in April that year, and they ate in the small room off the main hall that served as Clara's office, and they talked for 2 hours. Agnes was now officially seconded, part-time, to a working group on educational reform that reported to the Board of Education in London, and she was using her position there to do something Clara had not expected. She was building a case for the formal recognition of the Voss Foundation's methods as a model for the reform of elementary education nationally. She was doing this quietly, through the working group, without making it about Clara personally, but rather about the practices and results. She was, in other words, exactly the kind of ally that Clara had not known how to look for, and had found through the accident of a personal letter, written, because 2 years of thinking had finally outrun the hesitation about sending it. Clara listened to all of this over their lunch. When Agnes had finished, she said, "What do you need from me?" Agnes said, "More pamphlets if you can, and permission to cite the school by name in formal submissions." Clara said, "You have permission." "The pamphlets are more complex." Agnes said, "I know, but they matter." Clara said, "The problem with pamphlets is that they take time I do not have." Agnes said, "Could you dictate?" Clara looked at her. She said, "To whom?" Agnes said, "To anyone. One of the older students perhaps, the ones who are good at transcription." Clara thought about this for a moment. It was the kind of thought that seemed impractical at first and then, with a turn of the angle, became obvious. She said, "Harriet." Agnes said, "Yes, Harriet." Harriet Owens, who had started as a student helper and had been her main assistant for years, who was meticulous and quick, and who understood what Clara was trying to say before Clara finished saying it. Harriet was exactly the person. She began dictating to Harriet that same month. They worked on Thursday evenings, when the school was quiet. Clara would walk, because she always thought better walking, and Harriet would sit at the desk with a notepad and write. Clara walked and talked, and Harriet wrote, and occasionally, when something Clara said was unclear or underdeveloped, Harriet said so in the plain, direct way she had, and Clara would stop and go at it again from a different angle. It was a strange and very good way to work. The writing that came from it was cleaner than the writing she produced alone at night, less careful in a way that made it better, less labored, more like what she actually thought, rather than what she thought she should be thinking. She recognized this distinction, and did not try to overcorrect the dictated drafts, only shape them. The 4th pamphlet was finished by November. It was 40 pages, and it was called The Teacher's First Obligation, and it argued that the first obligation of anyone who taught a child was not to the curriculum, or the institution, or the family's expectations, but to the child's own developing sense of what they were capable of. It said that most damage done to children in schools was not done through cruelty, but through the much commoner failure of not believing sufficiently in what was in front of you, of treating a child as a representative of a category, rather than as the specific and surprising person they actually were. It said this in plain language, without hedging, without the qualifications that made educational writing palatable to educational administrators, but stripped it of everything that made it true. Agnes Fowler read the draft, and said it was the most direct thing Clara had written, and she was not sure the Board of Education would know what to do with it. Clara said she did not write it for the Board of Education. Agnes said she understood, and sent it to the press. Edmund wrote in November, back to his usual timing, and his letter this year was the longest yet. He had won the vote on the industrial schools legislation in October, with the amendment about teaching methods that cited, in general terms, the work being done in certain independently funded schools, which was as close as parliamentary language ever came to specificity. He said he was pleased not with the victory itself, but with what the language in the amendment would make possible for inspectors, who wanted to cite it as a standard. He said he had been thinking about what came next. He said he had attended, in September, a conference on elementary education in Birmingham, at which several people had mentioned the Voss Foundation pamphlets, and that the mentions had been serious, and not ceremonial, meaning people had actually read them, and were actually using them as tools, rather than as references. He said he thought it was time to consider what a second school would look like. He said this at the end of the letter, briefly, without pushing, as a question left open for her to answer when she was ready. She was not ready to answer it immediately. She sat with the question for a month, which was how she sat with questions that mattered, and she rolled it around in her daily walk, and in the dictation sessions with Harriet, and in the 2 weeks of particularly bad coughing in December that kept her in bed for 3 days, and made her consider, with unusual honesty, the question of what would happen to the school if she were incapacitated. This last question was harder than the second school question, and produced more uncomfortable answers. She had built something that was genuinely hers, in its methods, in its culture, in the particular way the teachers here had been trained, and the particular way the children had been taught to expect to be treated. If she left, what remained? Were the practices embedded enough in the other teachers that the school would continue as she had made it? She did not know, and not knowing made her feel something she had not felt in a long time, afraid for something beyond herself. She got up when the December illness passed and went back to the classroom and taught and managed and walked and thought. She wrote to Edmund in January and said she was ready to think about the second school, and her primary condition was that the first school must be robust enough to run without her constant personal presence before she turned any attention to the second. She said this would require another year at minimum, possibly 2. She said she was not declining, she was specifying. He wrote back 3 days later, quickly, for someone who was also managing an estate and a parliamentary schedule, and said, 2 years is entirely acceptable, and the question will wait. She spent 1909 on the robustness problem. She promoted Harriet Owens to deputy head of school, which was a title they invented together because it did not exist in the standard educational vocabulary, and they needed it to. She documented the school's methods formally for the first time, not as a pamphlet for external readers, but as an internal guide for the teachers, specific and practical, written by Clara and edited by all 5 of the teachers together, in a series of Saturday morning meetings that ran through the summer. The document that emerged from those meetings was not grand or theoretical. It was a working guide. It said, when a child asks a question, do this. When a child goes quiet, consider this. When 2 children disagree, let the disagreement run for this long, and then do this. It said these things in plain language, because the people it was written for were people who taught every day and needed things they could actually use, not things they could admire. She gave each teacher a copy. She gave a copy to the trust board. She filed a copy in the school records. She sent a copy to Agnes Fowler, who said that it was going directly to the working group, and that she was not asking for permission this time, and Clara said that was fine. She did not think of the working guide as something that would be read by anyone outside the school. She thought of it as a tool for the people inside it. She was wrong about this, but she would not know she was wrong for another 2 years, and in the meantime she had a school to run, and the morning was waiting, and 27 children aged 5 to 7 were going to be asked what they had noticed, and she needed to be there for that. She walked to the school in the January morning and let herself in with her key, and stood in the main room in the early quiet. The south-facing windows were gray with winter light. The children's work was on the walls. The smell was chalk and books, and the faint warm residue of yesterday's lesson. She stood there for the usual 15 minutes, and did her thinking, and then she went to her office and opened the day's correspondence, and one of the letters was from a school in Leeds, where a teacher she had met through Agnes had been trying the 3 daily questions for 6 months, and wanted to report what had happened, and the report was 4 pages long, and specific, and full of the energy of someone who has found a thing that works, and cannot quite believe it works as well as it does. Clara read the 4 pages, and felt, in the still cold early morning of the school she had built from nothing, precisely satisfied. She wrote a reply that afternoon that was 2 pages long, and asked 7 follow-up questions, because the report had raised things she wanted to understand better, and understanding things better was, and had always been, the whole point. What she was building, in those years from 1906 to 1910, was something she did not have a name for, because she had not set out to build it, and had not thought of it as a project. She had been doing her work. The work had produced things, the pamphlets, the school, the teachers she had trained, the methods she had documented, and those things had circulated, and the circulation had produced effects, and the effects had come back to her in the form of letters from teachers in Leeds and Sheffield and Birmingham, and once, in 1909, from a woman in Dublin who said she had received a copy of the second pamphlet from a friend, and had been using it in her own small school, and would Miss Voss consider corresponding? Clara had written back immediately, because Dublin was far enough that the letter was evidence of something traveling beyond the range she had imagined, and she thought that something that traveled that far should be tracked. She began keeping a file of the letters. Not a formal record, she was not naturally a record keeper, preferring action to documentation in all things, but a simple folder in her office desk, where she put the letters from teachers who had used her methods and reported on what happened. The folder grew. By 1910, it had 43 letters. She read through them one evening in March, sitting at the office desk with her reading glasses on. She had started needing reading glasses the previous autumn, which she managed with the practical equanimity she gave to all physical facts she could not change. And she thought about what the 43 letters represented. They represented people, specific human beings in specific classrooms, who had read something she had written, and had changed something they did because of it, and then had written to tell her that the change had produced a good result. 43 such people. 43 classrooms. She estimated, conservatively, that those 43 classrooms served an average of 25 children each. She looked at the number that calculation produced. She sat with it for a while. She did not, then or later, make much of this in public. It was not in her nature to make much of things in public, and also, she was not sure the number was right, and she did not want to say a thing unless she was sure it was right. But she wrote about it to Agnes Fowler, because Agnes was the person she wrote to when she wanted to think something through in the form of a letter, and Agnes wrote back with a number that was larger, because Agnes had been tracking things from the Board of Education side and had information Clara did not have, and said that what Clara had built was, in the technical language of education reform, a method with demonstrable transferability, which was the hardest thing to achieve and the thing that most methods failed at, and that this needed to be on the record somewhere. The record, in the form that Agnes meant, came in 1910 in the shape of a formal review conducted by the Board of Education's Working Group on Elementary Methods. The review looked at 8 schools that had adopted practices associated with the Voss Foundation pamphlets and measured their results against comparable schools using standard methods. The results were not dramatic. Nothing in education reform is dramatic if it is genuine, but they were clear and they were consistent, and the review document said so in the measured, hedged language of official reports, which nonetheless communicated, to anyone reading carefully, that something significant was happening in those classrooms. Agnes sent Clara a copy of the review, with a note that said simply, "This is not nothing." Clara read the review and wrote back, "No, it is not nothing." She put the review in the folder with the 43 letters, and went to teach the morning lesson. Edmund's letter that November was different from all the previous ones, in a way she noticed before she fully understood what the difference was. It was not longer. It was not more formal. The difference was in one sentence near the end. After all the usual specific questions about the school, and the expansion, and the trust accounts, the sentence said, "I will be in Manchester in December, for a meeting with the local Board of Education, and I would be grateful if you would have dinner with me." Not a meeting, not a discussion of the trust. Dinner. She read the sentence, and then looked at the wall of her office for a moment, and then read the rest of the letter, and then went back to the sentence. She had not, in the 10 years since the hotel meeting, had any occasion with Edmund that was not structured around the work and the trust. This sentence was about neither. She considered her response for 3 days. Not because she was uncertain about the answer. She was not uncertain about the answer, but because she wanted to be certain about her reasons, and certain about what she was saying yes to, and certain that the clarity she had maintained for 20 years about who she was and what mattered was not in the process of becoming less clear. She examined her own state with the same honest attention she had given to all the important questions of her life. She found, at the end of 3 days, that she was clear. She said yes because she wanted to. She said yes because Edmund was the person in her life who most understood what she was trying to do with the time she had, and dinner with such a person was a thing to be accepted rather than analyzed away. She wrote back and said she would be glad to have dinner, and suggested a place, the same hotel, because she was not sentimental, but she did think it was honest, and posted the letter. He arrived in Manchester on the 12th of December. She was in the school when he arrived, because she was always in the school, but Harriet Owens had been told he might come and met him at the door, and showed him through the main hall where 4 of the younger children were doing a reading exercise under the supervision of Francis Brent. He stood in the doorway of the main hall and watched for a few minutes before Harriet brought him to Clara's office. Clara looked up from what she was reading when he appeared in the doorway, and she looked at him. 34 years old now. The coat he wore that was exactly the right quality without being remarkable. The same attention in his eyes. Older and less raw than she remembered it, but not changed in kind. And she said, "You watched the lesson." He said, "For a few minutes." She said, "What did you notice?" He paused, and she saw him understand what she was asking, and then he smiled. Not the almost smile of the 11-year-old, but the real one, the one that reached his eyes. And he said, "The girl on the left side is reading ahead. She is waiting for the others to catch up." Clara said, "She always does." He said, "What do you do about it?" She said, "I give her a harder book." He said, "And what does she do?" Clara said, "She reads ahead in that one too." He said, "Like someone else you knew?" She said, "Yes, like someone else I knew." They looked at each other for a moment, and then she said, "Give me 10 minutes to finish this letter, and then we will go." He said, "Of course," and stepped back into the hallway, and she went back to the letter, and 10 minutes later, they walked out into the December evening together. The dinner was 2 hours long, and covered, in that time, the expansion plans for the school, and the legislation, and the working group, and the question of the second school, which was now actively being considered, and also other things outside the professional accounting that had structured all their previous contact. He talked about his children, whom she had not met and knew only as facts. 3 of them, the youngest 4 years old, and, he said, already asking questions he could not answer about why birds went south in winter. She said that was a good sign. He said it was a very good sign, and that he had a theory about where it came from. She said she had heard that theory before. He said it had proven correct. She said she was glad. They talked about his wife, who was well, and who ran, it emerged, the charitable work connected to the estate with a practicality that Edmund clearly respected rather than merely acknowledged, and Clara formed an impression of a woman who had made a good partner for the man Edmund had become. She was glad of this too, specifically, and without complication. She had never been someone who felt complicated about other people's happiness. They finished dinner and walked back through the December streets to the hotel door, and he said goodbye with the same formal courtesy he had always had, and that now seemed to contain, underneath it, the acknowledgement of something that did not need to be named, because it was already perfectly well understood between them. She walked home to Marsden Street and let herself into the flat, and made tea, and stood at the kitchen window looking at the December city, and thought about what it meant to be known by someone across such a distance of time and change and circumstance. She thought it was one of the things that made a life feel like a life, rather than a series of disconnected events. She did not think about what she might have wanted if things had been different, because things were what they were, and what they were was good, and that was more than enough. She went to bed at 9, as she had promised Dr. Breyer she would, and she slept well, and in the morning she woke and dressed and walked to the school, and let herself in with her key, and stood in the south light of the main room, and did her thinking. And then she went to teach, and she asked 127 children what they had noticed, and they told her, and she was fully there for every answer. The second school opened in Sheffield in September of 1911, and Clara was there for the opening, the same way she had been there for the first opening, early, practical, carrying things that needed carrying. She had spent 18 months preparing it, which meant she had spent 18 months preparing herself to hand it over, because the Sheffield school was going to be hers, in the same way the Manchester school was hers, in method and in founding. But it was not going to be hers in the way of daily presence. She had Agnes Fowler in Sheffield, who had quietly become more than an education administrator over the years, and had in the past 2 years been working alongside Clara, in a capacity that was harder to name than administrator, but clearly more than advisor. Agnes knew the method, because she had watched it for 10 years. She also had a teacher named Dorothy Watts, whom Clara had identified 2 years ago through Agnes's networks, and spent those 2 years training, and who was, Clara was fairly certain, one of the best teachers she had ever watched work. Dorothy Watts was going to run the Sheffield school. Clara was going to let her. The letting go was the hardest part, not because she did not trust Dorothy. She did trust Dorothy, as completely as she trusted anyone who was not Harriet Owens, but because she had spent 20 years being the person who was there, and the habit of being there was so deep that its absence had a specific physical quality, like a tooth that is gone and the tongue still searches for it. She managed this by being very busy and by focusing, in the months around the opening, on the Manchester school, which always had demands that expanded to fill the attention she gave it. She told herself she was not anxious. She was partially lying. She went to Sheffield once a month for the first year. She came without announcement, not to catch anyone doing something wrong, but because announced visits changed rooms, and she needed to see the rooms as they were, not as they were presented. Dorothy Watts understood this without being told, because Dorothy Watts was the kind of teacher who was the same, whether being watched or not, which was exactly why Clara had hired her. The Sheffield school had 61 children in its first year, and grew to 85 by the following spring, and the waiting list materialized within the month, because the thing she had discovered in Manchester was apparently also true in Sheffield. There were always more families who wanted this than there were places to offer. She watched Dorothy Watts teach, and found the experience reassuring, in the specific way that it is reassuring to see your own thinking, inhabited by someone else, and made better in small ways. Dorothy did things Clara would not have done. She had a technique for working with the shyest children that was different from Clara's, quieter, slower, with a kind of patient physical stillness that drew the child toward her rather than toward the lesson, and the effect was remarkable. Clara watched it once, and then sat with Dorothy after the lesson, and asked her how she had developed it. Dorothy said she had been a very shy child herself, and remembered what had worked. Clara said, "Write that down," Dorothy said. "For the school records?" Clara said, "For everything, for the next pamphlet." Dorothy looked at her. She said, "You want me to contribute?" Clara said, "I want you to write the section about shy children, because you know it better than I do." Dorothy was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "All right," Clara said, "good." And that was how the fifth pamphlet acquired its second author, which was a development that Clara had not expected, and that mattered more than the pamphlet itself. The fifth pamphlet came out in 1912. It was the first one to list two authors, and the addition of Dorothy Watts's name was not a courtesy or a gesture. The section she had written was the strongest part of the document, technically precise and emotionally accurate, in the way that only someone who has been both the teacher and the shy child can achieve. Clara told her this, directly, when she read the finished draft. Dorothy said she had learned to see the shy child from Clara, who had taught Dorothy to notice what was happening, rather than what was expected to happen. Clara said that was generous. Dorothy said it was accurate. They sat with the completed manuscript on the table between them, and they were both quiet for a moment, in the comfortable way of people who have the same work, and then Clara put it in the envelope, and they went back to teaching. Edmund read the fifth pamphlet and wrote his November letter about it, with more depth than any of the previous ones, specifically because of Dorothy's section. He said, "The section on quiet children. It says something I have been trying to understand for 30 years, about a particular experience I remember. I should have been able to say this before. I could not." She understood what he meant. She did not make him say it more plainly than he had. She wrote back about the sections on reading aloud, and the methodology in the appendix, which she had some reservations about, and then added at the end, "The section you mentioned, Dorothy was the right person to write it." He wrote back, "I know, you found her," she said. "She was there already. I only looked." The years from 1911 to 1915 were the fullest of her life. Not in the sense of happiness. Happiness was not the word she would have used, but in the sense of fullness, of occupation, of a life whose hours were all in use. She was teaching at Manchester, and visiting Sheffield monthly, and corresponding with 47 teachers in 8 cities, and writing with Dorothy, and meeting with Agnes, and attending the Board of Education meetings that Agnes now required her to attend in person, rather than just sending material. She was working at a pace that was too fast for her health, and that she maintained by a careful management of the damage. She slept properly in the good months, to build a reserve for the bad ones. She ate what the doctor had specified even when it was inconvenient, and she let Harriet Owens manage the administrative details of the Manchester school with an increasing completeness that would have frightened her 10 years earlier, and now felt like exactly the right distribution of the work. Her health worsened in the winter of 1913. Not catastrophically. Nothing collapsed, nothing became a crisis. But the cough in that December was bad enough that she stayed home for 2 weeks at Dr. Breyer's insistence, and the 2 weeks produced a particular clarity about time that she had not had before. She lay in bed in the flat above the chandler's shop, which she had lived in for 12 years, and she looked at the ceiling, and she thought about what was still to be done. The second school, the pamphlets, the correspondence, the working guide, now in its third revision. All of this was in motion, but there was something else, something she had been putting off because there was always something more immediate, something she kept bumping against in the evenings, when the practical thinking was done, and the thinking that was not about the work had room to move. She had never written about what had made her, not directly, not as a piece of personal writing. Everything she had written had been about the work, the methods, the children, the teaching. Nothing had been about the process by which she had become the person who did the work. She had thought about this and decided, more than once, that it was not important, that the work was the point, and the worker was incidental, and that self-examination was something better people than she were suited for. But lying in bed in the December gray, she thought about it differently. She thought about the 47 teachers, and the second school, and the pamphlets that were now cited in official documents. And she thought about what had produced all of it. And she thought about a ditch in the rain in October, and a boy who had been burning with fever, and a decision made with the last 8 shillings she possessed. She thought about what it meant to say yes when you have nothing to spare. She sat up and reached for the notebook she kept by the bed, and she began to write. Not for publication, not for any external reader. She wrote for herself, because the 2 weeks of stillness had made room for something that had been waiting very patiently for room, and it had appeared, and she was going to honor it. She wrote for an hour each day for the 2 weeks she was home, and what she wrote was not polished, and was not organized, and was not the kind of document that could be given to a press, but it was true, in a way that nothing else she had written was quite so directly true. It was about the ditch, and the boy, and the inn, and the 8 shillings. It was about Ashford Hall, and the bench in the kitchen garden, and the housekeeper's expression at the kitchen window. It was about the factory, and the church school, and the stable, and the building with the south-facing windows. It was about 47 teachers asking 3,700 children what they had noticed. It was about what one decision, made from nothing, for no reason except that it was the right thing, could grow into if you kept tending it. She did not show this writing to anyone. She put it in the drawer under the pamphlets. She would look at it again someday, or she would not. And either way it had served its purpose, which was to clear something in her that the December rest had made enough room to see. She got up on the day Dr. Breyer said she could get up, and went back to the school and let herself in with her key, and stood in the early morning light, and did her thinking. And then she went to teach, and the morning was cold and clear, and 132 children were going to tell her what they had noticed. She told them what she had noticed. She had started this some years ago, reversing the exercise, once a week, telling them what she had seen, and the children's response to it had been one of the most interesting ongoing experiments she had ever run. They were startled, the first time, and then they were pleased, and then they were competitive about it in the way children are competitive about things that actually interest them, and now it was simply part of the Friday morning practice. She told them 3 things she had noticed, and they told her 3 things they had noticed, and the room was full of the specific, attentive, alive quality that she had been trying to create for 20 years, and she stood in the middle of it and thought that this particular quality of attention, in a room full of people who were all truly present, was the thing she had been working toward since she found a boy in a ditch and decided to stay. She wrote to Edmund that evening about the Friday practice. His letter, when it came in March, said he had been thinking about it since her description, and had started something similar in the monthly meetings he ran at the estate, asking the people present to say one thing they had noticed since the last meeting, that they had not expected to notice. He said the results had been instructive. She said that sounded about right. She said she was glad the practice had traveled. He said, "It has been traveling for 30 years. You only recently told me about this particular version." She put the letter on the pile to reply to, and went to the classroom, and asked 132 children what they had noticed. The war came in August of 1914, and it changed everything, in the way all large events change everything. Not suddenly, but by a long, slow, accumulating pressure that altered the landscape so gradually that you looked up one day, and the landscape was different, and you could not point to the moment when it had changed. Clara was 49 years old when the war started, and the first thing she noticed about it, from the position of a woman running 2 schools for working-class children in the north of England, was the fathers. The fathers disappeared first, and then the older brothers, and then the husbands of the mothers who brought the children to school. And the absences fell into the classrooms, in the form of a changed quality of attention. Children who arrived distracted. Children whose home situations had shifted overnight. Children who asked questions she did not have good answers to, because no good answers existed yet. She did not change what she did in response to the war. She could not think of anything to change that would serve the children better than continuing to do the work with full attention, which was always the response she defaulted to when things became difficult, and which she had long since stopped second-guessing. But she thought about it. She thought about the way the war functioned as a clarifier of what mattered, the same way that illness clarified things, or poverty, or loss, by removing the optional and leaving only what was essential. She thought about what was essential in a classroom. She thought it was attention, the willingness to be present with a child in the specific moment they occupied, not in the general shape of what the moment should be. This was always essential. In the context of a war, it was simply more visible. The Manchester school lost 2 teachers to volunteer work in 1915, both of them men, Alfred Cartwright, who had been there from early in the foundation's life, and a younger man named Owen Haynes, who had joined 2 years before. Clara managed the gaps with her usual practicality, which meant working harder than was advisable, and covering more of the teaching herself than Dr. Breyer would have approved of if she had told him, which she did not. Harriet Owens covered the administrative gaps. Frances Brent, who was now the senior teacher in the Manchester school, and who had been there since near the beginning, held the structure together with the steadiness of someone who has been doing something long enough to know how to do it in difficult conditions. Dorothy Watts wrote from Sheffield to say that the Sheffield school had lost 3 families entirely: fathers killed, mothers gone to other work, children uprooted and removed from the city. She said the remaining children were subdued in a way that was different from ordinary quiet, and that she was using a version of the 3 things practice every morning, rather than only in the afternoon, because it seemed to help to begin the day with something that required the children to look outward. Clara wrote back saying Dorothy's instinct was right, and that beginning with the outward looking was exactly what the situation required. She also sent a note to Agnes Fowler saying they needed to hire in Sheffield before the gaps became a structural problem, and Agnes, who was now running a wartime education committee from Manchester, which had expanded her official reach considerably, put the hiring in motion. Edmund's November letter in 1914 was the first one that did not include any questions about the school. It was brief, and it was about the parliamentary response to the war, and the specific issue of what would happen to education funding when the budgets were reorganized for wartime. And he was writing, he said, because he needed her view on which parts of what the foundation was doing were most vulnerable to funding pressure, and which could be protected. She wrote back with the specific information he needed. The endowment covered the core. The supplementary income from the trust's investments was the part that might be affected. The essential thing was to protect the teacher salaries, because the teachers were the method, and losing the teachers was losing everything. She wrote this clearly and quickly, and sent it the same day. He had people working on the committee that was setting the education funding framework, and her analysis would be more useful there than anywhere else. She also wrote, at the end of the letter, something she had not intended to write when she sat down. She said, "I am glad you are where you are, and doing what you are doing. I am glad the questions you were taught to ask are being asked in the right rooms." She paused after writing this, and looked at it for a moment, and then put it in the envelope, before she had time to take it out again. His reply came in December. It was short. It said, "I am glad there is someone whose opinion of the questions matters to me. It has helped more than I can say." She read this, and put it in the drawer with the other letters and the private writing she had done in December of the previous year, and she went to the classroom, and the morning was cold, and the war was going, and 129 children were there, which was 3 less than the previous week, and she stood at the front of the room and asked them what they had noticed. The years of the war were years of managed scarcity and continued work. She did not write any new pamphlets during the war. She did not have the time or the energy, and the country did not have the capacity to think about educational reform when it was organizing the survival of everything. She kept the school running, both schools, with the help of Harriet and Frances and Dorothy, and she maintained her correspondence with the teachers in other cities, which continued to matter, precisely because the war had made the question of what you did with children in a difficult world more urgent, not less. She went to Sheffield every month. She attended Agnes's wartime committee meetings. She did the work. What changed, in those years, was something she would not have predicted, and could not have planned. The other teachers changed. Not as individuals. They had been good teachers before the war, and remained good teachers during it. But the network of correspondence that had been building since Agnes Fowler's letter in 1900 had, by 1916, become something different in kind from what it had been. It was no longer a series of individual conversations between one woman and various teachers in various cities. It was a community. The teachers wrote to each other, directly, not always through her. She knew this because some of them told her so, and one of them sent her a letter that included an excerpt from a note she had received from Dorothy in Sheffield, which had in turn referenced something from a teacher in Leeds, and the excerpt contained an insight that none of the three teachers had arrived at independently, but that had emerged from the conversation between them. She read this excerpt and sat with it for a while, and thought about what it meant. It meant that the thing she had been trying to do, put something into the world that was useful and real, and that would keep working after she had done her part of the work, was doing that. It was working without her, between people who had never met her, in rooms she had never been in. The 47 teachers had become 61. The 61 were talking to each other. The conversations were producing things she had not thought of. The things she had built had become, without her quite noticing, larger than she was. She thought about this for a long time. She thought about it on the walks and in the early mornings in the school, and in the evenings, in the flat above the chandler's shop, where she had now lived for 15 years, and where the walls had accumulated, over those years, a specific sediment of her life. Books, papers, a drawing that one of the first generation of Manchester children had made of the classroom, and given her, and beside it, a framed copy of the first pamphlet's title page, which Agnes Fowler had given her on a significant birthday, and which she had accepted, and put on the wall without ceremony. She looked at the walls sometimes and thought about what they documented, and she thought that a life could be documented in many ways, and that the one she could see on the walls of this flat was an honest record. She thought that she was lucky, not in the sense of fortunate circumstances. Her circumstances had not been fortunate. She had built everything from very little, and had been dismissed without justification, and had been ill, and had been short of money, and had spent years in rooms that were too cold, and done work that was too hard for her body. She was lucky in the sense that the work she was made for had found her, or she had found it, which was the same thing from the inside. She was lucky in the sense that the decisions she had made from the worst positions had turned out to be right, or right enough, in ways she could not have calculated at the time, and could only see in retrospect. She was lucky in the sense that she knew what she was doing, and why, and that this knowledge had never left her, even in the hardest years, even in the ditch, and the factory, and the 2 weeks in bed in December, and the morning of the walk to Milford. She did not call this happiness either. It was something harder to name and more durable. She went to bed at 9, and woke early, and walked to the school, and let herself in with her key, and stood in the south light, and did her thinking. The war was going. The schools were open. The children were there. The morning was waiting. The peace came in November of 1918, and Clara was 53 years old, and the winter that year was the worst she had experienced, which might have been the ordinary winter of a difficult year, or might have been the kind of winter the body produces when it has been holding a great deal for a long time, and the holding has finally cost something that cannot be ignored. The cough was bad from October onward, and by December, Dr. Breyer was not diplomatic at all, which meant the situation had changed in a way that required plain speaking. He said she had pushed the lung condition past the point where pushing back was still an option. He did not say this dramatically. He said it in the quiet, careful way of a man who has known his patient for many years, and has watched her manage her health with intelligence and will, and has now arrived at the conversation he has been dreading, and is going to have it honestly, because that is what the patient deserves. She listened to him. She did not argue. She had learned, in the years of managing her health, to distinguish between the arguments she was qualified to make and the ones she was not. And a doctor saying her lungs had been compromised by cumulative damage was not an argument she was qualified to dispute. She asked the practical questions: what she could and could not do, how much this changed, what the progression looked like if she managed it carefully versus if she did not. Dr. Breyer answered the practical questions with practical precision. and she took notes in the small notebook she carried everywhere, because she had long since stopped trusting to memory for anything she needed to act on. She walked home from his surgery in the December cold, wearing the extra scarf that Harriet Owens had begun leaving on her chair without comment, and she made tea and sat at the kitchen table with her notes and thought about what needed to change. What needed to change was significant, and she was not going to pretend otherwise, because she had spent her whole life being honest about what was true, and she was not going to stop now, when what was true was inconvenient to herself rather than only to others. She could not continue at the pace she had been working. That was the first and simplest fact. The winter months in Manchester were too cold and too damp for what her lungs were now doing, which meant she needed to move the heaviest of her work to the better months and protect the winter as much as the school allowed. She could not attend the Sheffield school every month through the winter, which meant Dorothy Watts was going to have to operate with more independence than Clara had allowed herself to fully grant, which was not a reflection on Dorothy, but on the difficulty of fully letting go of a thing you have made. She sat with the notes for 2 hours, and then she picked up her pen, and she wrote. She wrote 3 letters. The first was to Harriet Owens, telling her what Dr. Breyer had said and what she had decided, and asking Harriet to take on 3 specific responsibilities that Clara had been holding herself for no better reason than habit. The second was to Dorothy Watts, telling her the same thing and saying directly what she had not said before, that the Sheffield school was Dorothy's school in all the ways that mattered, that the method was sound and the teachers were good, and Dorothy should trust her own judgment, which was excellent. The third letter was to Agnes Fowler, who would need to know, and who would handle the information with the practical intelligence she gave everything. She did not write to Edmund until the following week, when she had had time to settle into the changed version of things, and could write without the edge of the decision still raw. She wrote him a letter that was factual and direct, and did not ask for anything, because she had never written him asking for anything, and was not going to start with this. She told him what Dr. Breyer had said. She said the school was in good hands, Harriet and Frances and the teachers she had trained over 15 years, and that the trust was well managed and the endowment was secure. She said she expected to keep working, more slowly, and that the pamphlets were not finished, because there were still things she had not managed to put on the page. She said she was telling him because he deserved to know, not because she needed him to do anything. His reply came back in 4 days, which was faster than letters usually came from London, which told her something about how he had received the news. The letter was 1 page. It said very little that was direct, because he had always been someone who said difficult things sideways, which was one of the few things she had not successfully taught out of him. He said the trust would continue as it was, and that she should not worry about anything on that side. He said he would like to visit in the spring, if she was agreeable. He said he had been thinking about a conversation they had had a long time ago, in a hotel meeting room, and that she had said the school was a good enough reason to build the school, and that he had been right to agree. He said some things did not change with time. She read the letter twice, and then put it with the others in the drawer. She was not going to be the kind of person who collapsed at kindness. She had too much to do. The spring of 1919 was, in fact, better. Medically better. The cough eased in April the way it always had, but it eased to a higher baseline than before, and she managed the new baseline with the same rational inventory she had always applied to her own situation. She was working shorter hours. She was letting Harriet handle more. She was at the school every morning, but she was leaving at 4 rather than 7, and she was not carrying things home to do in the evenings, which had been such a constant practice for so long that its absence felt almost like a new sound in the flat above the chandler's shop. Not a silence exactly, but a different frequency. Edmund came in May. He stayed 2 days. He came the same way he had come for the school opening 15 years ago, early, practical, without ceremony, and wearing the coat that was always exactly right without being remarkable. He spent the first day at the school, which had changed considerably since his last visit. There were now 141 children and 7 teachers, and Harriet Owens running the administration, with a competence that had exceeded everything Clara had asked of her in the best possible way. He walked through the rooms with Clara, and they talked about what he saw, and she told him the things that were working, and the things that were not yet working as well as she wanted, and he listened with the same quality of attention that had been his most consistent characteristic since he was 8 years old. They had dinner again, at the same hotel. He was 42 now, and she was 54, and they sat across the table in the same room, And the difference between this and the dinner 8 years ago was the kind of difference that accumulates between two people who have known each other across a long span and have let the span become part of the relationship rather than a gap in it. He said his youngest was 10 now and had recently read a story in school and come home to report that the teacher had asked the class what they had noticed about the ending, and that this had struck her as the best question anyone had ever asked her about a book. Clara said 10 was a good age for that question. He said he had thought so too. He asked her, directly, how she was. Not in the social way, the way people ask and then provide their own answer before you have given yours, but in the actual way, the one that meant he was going to listen to the whole answer. She told him the truth, which was that she was well enough to work and intending to work, and that the pamphlets were not done, and the third school was still something she was thinking about, and that she had been thinking about writing something longer, not a pamphlet, something more complete, something that tried to say the whole thing, rather than the useful part of it. He said, "The thing you've been working toward in all of them." She said, "Yes, though I am not sure I will get there." He said, "You will." She said, "You do not know that." He said, "You told a sick child in a ditch that his mother was a star, with your last 8 shillings, and nothing to spare. You have been getting to things since then that other people said were not reachable." She looked at him across the table. She said, "I have been thinking about writing that." He said, "The ditch?" She said, "All of it. Not for publication, for the record, for, I don't know for whom exactly, for the children who will come to the school after I am gone, perhaps, so that they know what it was built from." He said, "Write it." She said, "I may." He said, "Write it for them. And for the ones who need to know what 8 shillings can grow into, when the person spending them is paying attention." She looked at him. She said, "That is more poetic than my usual approach." He said, "You taught me to notice. You have to accept what I notice." She said, "Fair enough." They finished their dinner and walked back to the hotel door in the May evening, and the city smelled of spring and coal smoke, and something she associated with possibility, which was perhaps only the smell of her own evening, but which felt, in that moment, like more than that. She began writing seriously, in the summer of 1919, not at the desk in the classroom. This was different work, private work, but at the kitchen table in the flat above the chandler's shop, in the mornings before she went to the school, in the 1 hour that the new pace of things allowed her without borrowing from anything else. She wrote steadily. She wrote about the road and the ditch and the inn and the boy and the Duke. She wrote about Ashford Hall and the library and the bench and the books she had chosen and the walk she had taken down the drive in the February cold. She wrote about the factory and the church school and the stable and the woman she had been in each of those places, which was the same woman, only with more information. She wrote about the hotel meeting room and the documents and the south-facing windows. She wrote about the teachers and the correspondence and the Friday morning practice and the way the thing had grown beyond the size she had imagined it could be, from the position of a woman with 8 shillings and a sick child and the decision to stay. She wrote 30 pages over the summer. She did not know what they were. Not a pamphlet, not a memoir, not anything she had a name for. She called the document, in her own head and on the cover page she eventually made for it, simply, Notes. She put it in the drawer with the personal writing she had done in December of 1913, and with Edmund's letters, and with the 43 original teachers' letters that had become 61, and were now, the last time she had counted, over 100. She put it there, and she left it there, and she went back to the school. The third school opened in Leeds in 1920, which was later than she had planned, and exactly when it was ready. It was Dorothy Watts who found the right teacher for it, a man named Hugh Birch, 40 years old, who had been a schoolmaster before the war, and had come back from the war, with the particular quality of people who have survived something large, and have decided to use the time that remains on things that matter. Dorothy identified him, Clara interviewed him, and within 20 minutes of the interview she had offered him the position, and he had accepted it. The Leeds school had 53 children on its opening day, and a waiting list by the end of the first month, and Clara attended the opening, and carried chairs the same way she always had, and Hugh Birch watched her doing this, and said nothing until afterward, when he said he had not expected the founder of the 3 schools to be carrying chairs. She said the chairs needed to be somewhere. He said he had not meant it as a criticism. She said she knew. 3 schools, 153 teachers who had been trained in the Foundation's methods directly, or who had learned them. through the correspondence network. 112 teachers who had written to say they had read the pamphlets and changed what they did. 4 pamphlets in print, a 5th co-authored with Dorothy, notes for a 6th that she had been adding to for 2 years, the working guide in its 4th revision. The reading rooms, 2 now, Leeds having opened one within 3 months of the school. The trust, funded and managed, solid. The endowment secure. Harriet Owens running Manchester. Dorothy running Sheffield. Hugh Birch learning Leeds. Clara was 55 years old. She stood in the Leeds school on its opening day, with her coat on, because the October air was cold, and she looked at 53 children coming through the door, and she asked them what they had noticed. They were too young, and too new, and too tentative to answer well yet. They would get there. She had time. The 6th pamphlet was finished in the spring of 1921. She had been adding to the notes for 2 years, and the notes had grown into something she was finally ready to call complete, which meant she had said everything she was going to be able to say about it in this form. It was about what she called, in the pamphlet, the long work. The idea that teaching a child to think was not a thing done in a single lesson or a single year, but was an accumulation of small, consistent acts, each of which was almost invisible in isolation, but which together, over time, produced something that was unmistakable when you saw it. A person who noticed things and thought about what they noticed, and was not afraid to say what they thought. She said this in the 6th pamphlet more plainly than she had ever managed to say it before, which she attributed partly to the fact that she now had 50 years of evidence, and partly to the fact that she had less time to be indirect. The 6th pamphlet was published in autumn of 1921. Agnes Fowler had written the introduction, which was the first time Clara had allowed anyone else to write an introduction to her work, and which she had allowed because Agnes was the right person, and because the introduction Agnes wrote was so accurate and so clear that to decline would have been to put her own discomfort above the work's interest, which she was not willing to do. The introduction said, in plain language, that the pamphlets of Clara Voss represented the most practically useful body of work on elementary teaching methods produced in Britain in the previous 30 years, and that the schools she had founded were the proof of the method's effectiveness, and that anyone working in education who had not read them was working without important tools. It said this without any of the hedging or qualification that usually surrounded such claims in official educational circles. Clara read the introduction and thought that Agnes had overstated the case, and then thought about it more carefully, and decided Agnes had stated it accurately, which was a different thing. She sent Agnes a note saying thank you, and 2 questions about the 3rd section of the introduction, where she thought the argument could be tightened. Agnes wrote back with 1 answer and a defense of the other, which was what Agnes always did, and which Clara found she liked, which was one of the reasons she had come to value Agnes Fowler beyond any other professional relationship she had. Agnes argued back. It was among the rarest and most useful qualities in a person. Edmund's letter came in November of 1921, a month after the 6th pamphlet was published, and it was the longest he had ever sent. It was 6 pages, which was remarkable for a man who had always tended to brevity. He wrote about the pamphlet with the specificity of someone who had read it carefully, and then read it again, which she had come to recognize as his way of reading things that mattered to him. He wrote about the section on the long work, and he said that it was, along with Dorothy Watts's section on quiet children in the 5th pamphlet, the piece of writing of hers that he thought would last the longest, because it described the thing that most people never understood about real education, that it worked by accumulation rather than by event, by the small daily choice to show up and be present and take the child seriously, and that most of the results of this were not visible during the years of the work, but became visible afterward, in the person the child had grown into, and in what that person did with their life. He said, toward the end of the 6 pages, that he had been rereading some things lately, going through papers from the estate, the old years, and that he had found something he was sending her separately. She read this, and put the letter down, and looked at the envelope. There was nothing else in it. She looked at the outer envelope. There was another envelope inside that she had not seen, tucked under the first page of the letter. She opened it. It was small, old, sealed with a different hand, and it contained a single piece of paper, yellowed at the edges. On the paper, in a child's handwriting, were the words, "She said stars." She sat at the kitchen table for a long time. The October light came through the kitchen window, and the flat above the chandler's shop was quiet around her, and the piece of paper sat in her hand. She did not know, even now, as he had said in his letter, which she went back to and reread, Whether he had kept it or she had, she could not remember. She could remember the night, the inn, the cold, the fever, the things she had said about stars because it was kind, and because she had needed to say something. She could remember the boy's face in the morning, when the fever broke, clear-eyed and exhausted, and the way he had looked at her, with the frank assessment of someone taking a new piece of information seriously. She could remember the drive to Ashford Hall in the carriage, with the rain on the windows. She could remember all of it, with the particular sharpness of things that were important at the time, and had remained important in the way of seeds rather than events, working underground, producing growth that was not visible until much later. She put the piece of paper in the drawer, with the letters and the notes, and the 43 teachers' letters that had grown to over 100, and the private writing she had done in December of 1913, when the winter had made room. She put it there gently. She sat at the table for a while longer. Then she picked up her pen and she wrote Edmund a letter that was 2 pages, the longest she had written since the early years of the foundation. She wrote about the 6th pamphlet, and about the Leeds School, and about the correspondence network, which was now approaching 150 teachers. She wrote about Dorothy Watts, who had produced her own first pamphlet the previous year, which Clara thought was better in several places than her own first pamphlet. She wrote about Harriet Owens, who had declined 2 offers from larger institutions to remain at the Manchester school, which Clara took as the highest possible endorsement of what the school was. At the end of the letter she wrote, "I remember what I said. I meant it, and I was right." He would know what she meant, because the thing about writing to someone who had known you since they were 8 years old was that very few things needed to be explained. His reply came in 4 days again, which she had noticed was the speed at which things that moved him traveled. He said, "I know. I have always known. It was the first true thing I heard after she died, and I have held it since." She put the letter in the drawer. She went to the school. She taught through the winter of 1921, with the cough at its worst level yet. And Dr. Breyer said what he always said, and she managed what she could manage, and she did not stop teaching, because stopping was not available to her in the way it might have been to someone who had not built their life around a specific and irreplaceable purpose. She reduced hours. She let Harriet handle more. She taught the morning sessions, because the morning sessions were her particular domain, and she was not willing to give them up, and the mornings were often better. The cold of the very early morning was not the same as the damp cold of midday, and she moved through the morning hours with the care of someone who has learned exactly how much they can do, and is doing precisely that. She worked on the notes. The document she had begun in 1919 at the kitchen table had grown by now to 70 pages, and she had started to understand what it was. It was the account she had wanted to write, of the ditch and what grew from it. It was not a pamphlet. It was a record. It was the truth of how one thing had led to another, starting from a decision made with no certainty and no safety margin, made because it was right, and tracing the thread from there through 20 years of teaching and 30 years of building, and all the places and people and mornings and lessons and letters and 3 schools and the pamphlets and the correspondence, and everything that had been produced by the single act of staying. She was not sure she would finish it. She thought she would. She was not finished with the work, and the work was not finished with her, and the writing was part of the work, and she intended to keep going until she could not, which was the only intention she had ever been able to keep. She went to the school every morning and let herself in with her key and stood in the south light. She asked 141 children in Manchester, 87 children in Sheffield, and 71 children in Leeds, through Dorothy and Hugh, who had learned to ask the question the way she had taught it, what they had noticed. 300 children, every day, paying attention to the world and being told that their attention mattered. She was 56 years old, and it was the winter before the last good spring she would have, though she did not know that yet, and the morning was cold, and the light was coming through the windows, and the children were there, and the work was not finished. She picked up the chalk. Clara Voss died on the 14th of September, 1922, on a Thursday morning, in the flat above the chandler's shop on Marsden Street, where she had lived for 20 years, and where the walls had accumulated everything she had made. She was 57 years old. It was early, before the school opened, and the morning light was coming through the kitchen window at the angle that she had always said was the best light of the day. Harriet Owens, who had a key and who had developed, over the years, the habit of arriving early enough to make sure Clara had eaten breakfast before going to the school, found her at the kitchen table. The table had the notes on it. She had been working. Dr. Breyer wrote the death certificate with the quiet precision of a man who has both expected and dreaded a thing, and now finds he must process both at once. He said the cause was the cumulative lung condition, the one that had begun in the factory in Manchester 30 years ago, and had been managed and held back and worked around, and had finally arrived at its own conclusion. He said she had not suffered. Harriet Owens, who had arrived at the right moment to matter and too late to help, held this information and kept it. It was not the kind of information that needed to be distributed widely. What needed to be distributed widely was the other kind. Word reached the schools within the day. Dorothy Watts in Sheffield received a telegram from Harriet and read it in her office with the door closed, and then she went into the main room and told the children in the plain, direct way that Clara had always recommended for hard truths, that Miss Voss had died that morning, that she had spent her whole life building things that helped children learn, and that the best way the children could honor her was to keep doing exactly what they were doing. Dorothy said this without crying, because she had learned from Clara that composure was not the absence of feeling, but the decision about where to put it. She cried later, in the office, with the door closed. Hugh Birch in Leeds received a letter and sat with it for a long time before going to his classroom. Edmund received the news in London on the afternoon of the 14th. He was in a meeting when the telegram was brought to him, and he looked at it, and then looked at the meeting room, and said that he needed to leave. He said this without explanation, which was so unusual for him that the people in the meeting said nothing, and he went. Agnes Fowler, who had been notified by Harriet at the same time, was already on her way to Manchester by the time Edmund's carriage reached Euston. He arrived in Manchester on the evening of the 15th. He went first to the school, because Harriet was there, and because the school was where the things that needed to be done were going to be organized. He stood in the main room, the room with the south-facing windows that Clara had specified to the architect, the room where 300 mornings of asking children what they had noticed had accumulated in the walls, and he stood there for a while without speaking. Harriet stood with him. Agnes was in the corner with a notebook, because Agnes's response to difficulty was always to list what needed to be done, which was one of the reasons she and Clara had suited each other so well. None of them said anything for a long minute. Then Edmund said, "She was working at the table." Harriet said yes. He said, "Was it the notes?" Harriet said yes. He said, "Good." He meant it. The working was right. The working at the table, on a September morning, with the light coming through at the best angle, this was exactly the shape the ending should have had for a person who lived the way she had lived, and he was glad of it. The notes were 78 pages. Harriet had found them on the table, and had gathered them carefully, and put them in the drawer where Clara kept important things, alongside the letters, and the personal writing, and the small envelope with the piece of paper in it. Edmund asked to see them. Harriet brought them to him. He read them that evening in the school office, sitting at the desk Clara had used for 20 years, and he read all 78 pages, and when he had finished, he sat for a while looking at the wall, where a drawing was pinned, a child's drawing of the classroom, the one that had been made by one of the first-generation Manchester children, and given to Clara, and that had been on every wall she had occupied since. He sat for a long time. He told Agnes the next morning that the notes should be published. Agnes said she agreed, and that she had already thought about which press, and had an opinion, which she gave, and they spent an hour discussing it, with the practical focus of people who are doing the only useful thing available to them, which is the thing the person they have lost would have wanted done. Agnes said she would handle the editorial side. Edmund said the trust would cover the costs. Harriet said she would organize the papers, the letters, the teacher's correspondence, the working guide and its revisions, the complete collection of pamphlets, into an archive that could be held by the school and accessed by anyone who needed it. She said she had been thinking about how to do this for some time. Clara had told her once, Harriet said, that a school's most important documents were not the administrative ones, but the ones that showed how it had thought, and that those should be kept somewhere anyone could find them. The funeral was on the 17th. It was not large. Clara had not been a public figure in the way of people who are known for being known, but it was full of people who had known her specifically, which was a different kind of fullness. Dorothy Watts was there, and Hugh Birch, and Francis Brent, who had been at the Manchester school for almost its entire existence. Agnes Fowler sat in the front row and looked at the floor with the expression of someone who is thinking hard about something practical, which was Agnes's version of grief. The teachers from the correspondence network who could get there in time were there, 23 of them, from Sheffield and Leeds and Birmingham and Dublin. The woman from Dublin having traveled overnight by boat. Several of the parents of children who had attended the school over the years were there. Meg Thorpe was there, from the reading room, with 2 of the women from the Thursday reading circle, and she sat in the pew and held a handkerchief in her hands and looked at it. Edmund attended with his wife, who had known about Clara Voss for 20 years and had understood, with the intelligence she brought to most things, that understanding was the right response. They sat in the church, and he held himself very straight, which was not a performance of composure, but the real thing. The thing he had developed from the boy who had learned to be still in difficult situations, which had been taught to him partly by the woman they were there to mourn. He did not give a eulogy. He had written one in the days since the telegram. He had it in his pocket. He had been sitting with the question of whether to read it since he arrived in Manchester, and by the time the service began he had made his decision. He put it back in his pocket without opening it. He had thought about her words, that the work was the eulogy, and that anyone who needed telling would not be helped by being told. After the service, the people who had come from a distance gathered at the school, which was still open. Harriet had kept it open, because Clara would have kept it open, and the children of the school were there, coming and going with the subdued energy of children who have been told something serious and are processing it in the way children process things, which is sideways, through action and noise, and the occasional unexpected stillness. Edmund stood in the main room and watched a group of 7-year-olds sitting at a table doing their writing, with the careful concentration of children who are entirely present in what they are doing, and he watched this for a few minutes, and then he turned to Harriet Owens, who was standing beside him, and he said, "Is anyone still asking them?" Harriet said, "Every morning." He said, "Good," and he meant this too, in the same way he had meant good, about the working at the table, as the recognition that the thing that needed to continue was continuing, and that the person who had built it well enough to continue without her, which was the highest thing you could say about something a person had made. The notes were published the following year, in 1923, in a small edition, by a press that Agnes Fowler had worked with before and trusted. The title was the one Clara had used on the cover page she had eventually made for the document, Notes. The introduction was written by Agnes Fowler, who had also written the introduction to the 6th pamphlet, and who wrote this one with the same clarity and the same refusal to overstate, saying only that what followed was the account of how a person who had nothing but the willingness to stay had built something that would outlast her, and that anyone who read it would understand both why it had been built and how. Edmund read the published version when it arrived, and found that the reading, on the page, in print, with the pages turning in his hands, was a different experience from the reading in the school office. It was more complete. He understood, reading it in its final form, that she had known what she was writing toward, and that she had gotten there. Not tidy, not complete in the way of finished things, but there in the way of things that have said what they needed to say, and can now be left. He kept his copy of the notes on his desk. He had kept her pamphlets there for 20 years, all 6, in a row, the spines reading like a record of a mind working toward something, and he added the notes at the end of the row. He looked at the row sometimes and thought about what it represented. He thought about the hotel meeting room in 1900, when she had taken the documents and put them in her bag, and the way she had said she would read them properly before she signed anything, because she was not the kind of person who did things before she had thought about them, even when the person asking was someone she trusted. He thought about the south-facing windows, and the working guide, and the 61 teachers who had become 150. He thought about the 3 schools, each of which was open on the morning of the day he was thinking this, each of which was full of children, who were being asked what they had noticed. The Voss Foundation continued for many years after Clara's death. It continued under Harriet Owens, who ran the Manchester School until 1938, with the same competence and the same refusal to leave for more prestigious positions that had always characterized her relationship to the work. It continued under Dorothy Watts in Sheffield, who published 3 more pamphlets of her own, all of which cited Clara's methods, and developed them in directions Clara had not imagined, which was exactly what Clara had hoped Dorothy would do. It continued under Hugh Birch in Leeds, who trained 6 teachers over his tenure, who went on to found their own schools. The correspondence network that Clara had begun, without intending it, continued and grew, and by 1930, had over 200 members. Edmund ensured the trust continued to be funded and well managed for the rest of his life. He attended the annual Voss Foundation lectures, established in 1925, Agnes Fowler's idea, funded by the trust, and he sat in the audience every year and listened, and he never gave a speech, because he had made a decision at the funeral and he kept it. The lectures were for the teachers and the educators, and the people who were doing the work, and his job was to sit in the audience and understand that this was how it should be. The archive that Harriet Owens organized was held at the Manchester School for 50 years before it was transferred, intact, to a university library, where it was catalogued and made available for research. The catalog included the 6 published pamphlets, the 5th co-authored with Dorothy Watts, the working guide in 4 revisions, 312 letters from teachers in 8 cities, the correspondence with Edmund, 18 years of it, bound separately, the personal writing from December of 1913, the notes, in manuscript form as well as in print, and one small envelope, unremarkable, in which was a single piece of paper with the words, "She said stars," in a child's handwriting. The catalog noted that the provenance of this item was not known, that it had been found in the drawer among the papers and had been included without attribution, because attribution was not possible, and because leaving it out felt wrong. Edmund died in 1948, at the age of 79, in the house at Ashford Hall, that had been his family's house, and that was by then different in the way large houses become different when they are lived in, rather than managed. Softer at the edges, less formal, the library used, rather than preserved. His 3 children were grown. The estate was being transitioned, as he had arranged, to a charitable trust that would manage it for public use. His papers were being organized by the youngest of his children, a woman named Margot, who had her father's quality of attention and her grandfather's systematic organization, and who was going through the papers with a care that acknowledged this was a job that mattered. In his desk, she found a row of books, 7 of them, the 6 pamphlets, and the notes, and beside them a bundle of letters. The letters were tied with a brown string and addressed in the same clear hand throughout, signed in each case with the same name. Margot read 3 of them, sitting at her father's desk, and then put them down and sat for a while. What she had read was not intimate in the sense she might have expected. It was something else. 2 people, writing to each other over many years about a shared work, with a quality of understanding between them that was more than professional and less than what people usually meant by the other thing, and that was, in its own particular form, complete. She put the letters with the other papers for the archive. She made a note about them. She was thorough, and she was her father's daughter, and she understood that things should be kept and kept properly. The archive she sent them to was the same university library that held the Voss Foundation papers. The 2 collections were kept separately, catalogued separately, but a researcher working in either collection was directed to the other by a note in the finding aids. The notes were written by the same librarian, who had read both collections and thought it was important that they were understood in relation to each other, because a life was not only what you did, but also what you were part of, and both of these were what they were because of each other. The librarian wrote this, in the finding aid, in the plain language that finding aids use, and in the plain language, it was true. On the wall of the main room of the Manchester School, which became a community education center in the 1970s, and which still served that function in a building that had been extended twice since Clara's architect built the original, there was a framed photograph. It was taken in 1906, outside the converted stable, on the day before the school moved to the new building. In the photograph, Clara Voss is standing in the doorway of the stable, with Harriet Owens and Frances Brent, and 7 of the children, who are ranging in height from about knee level to waist level, and who are all looking at different things, except for one, who is looking directly at the camera with the particular expression of a child who has been asked what they notice, and is noticing this. Clara is looking at the child. It is a photograph of a woman who is paying full attention to a specific person in the specific moment they occupy. It is a photograph of the thing itself. Below the photograph there was a small card, added sometime in the 1950s, that read, "Clara Voss, founder." She said, "Every child who comes through a door wanting to learn deserves to be treated as though what they want matters." No one was sure when she had said this exactly, but she had said it, and the people who had known her had all separately remembered it in the same words, which was as good an indication as any that it was true. And the door was still open, and the children were still coming through it, and every morning someone stood at the front of a room and asked them what they had noticed. That was how it ended. That was also how it began, and how it continued, and what it was. A question, asked again and again, in the same room and in other rooms, and an answer, different every time, and a person present enough to hear it. The morning arriving, the light coming through the south-facing windows, the work not finished, the chalk in hand,